If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
What happened to make you believe that cryptids and otherworldly creatures might be real? Do you have a story that convinced you Bigfoot, Mothman, Skinwalkers, Dogman, or other monsters might actually be out there in the real world?
My brother claims to have seen something truly evil. I don't know what to think. This is my brother's first-hand account. On February 23, 2024, I was driving my motorcycle around Chattanooga, Tennessee, around 10 p.m. The moon was full, and the weather was perfect. I went from Chattanooga to Fort Oglethorpe in the Chickamauga battlefield. I turned left onto a road and then a right onto another road. I had my bright LED headlights illuminating all the trees and Civil War statues. At 10:30 p.m., I drove up on a reflection at a distance of 200 to 300 feet away. I immediately thought it was out of place and unusual. No vehicles, and I'm about a 3/4 mile from the main road through the battlefield. Driving closer and closer, the reflection is about 7 feet off the ground, right by a tall statue of about 12 feet tall and about 3 feet by 6 feet rectangular. The statue is smooth and made of either marble or granite. Nothing to hold on to. And this reflection begins moving. I'm now about 100 feet away, and the reflection disappears behind the statue for about 2 seconds. I was confused and kind of freaked out because I thought it was a huge man trying to hide from me and maybe had something reflective on a hat. Then it reappeared and moved from behind the statue to rotate, still being behind it as I drove by. I was driving at about 25 miles per hour. It was a dark, black figure constantly moving. At about 7 feet tall with huge eyes. They reflected so brightly. Shades of orange, greens, and whites. These eyes were like tangerines. Huge. Immediately I felt terror. A horrible fear and goosebumps all over my body. I sped away, freezing and shaking, hoping it wasn't chasing me. But it left me alone. Whatever it was something I've never encountered. I'm an avid hunter here in North Georgia. I've had several experiences with wildlife at night. This was no animal, in my humble opinion. I'm no expert in anything. But this experience felt supernatural and evil. It watched me from behind the statue even while I was driving past it. I don't know how to explain it. This really happened. What the hell is going on here? Has anyone else heard of any similar sightings in the Northwest Georgia area? Thanks in advance. An Appalachian shadow creature. Around 2 years ago, one of my friends was moving from the Appalachia region to Florida in a few days, and we decided to go catfishing before he left. We didn't catch anything that night on the river, and we left around 2 to 3 a.m. On the drive back, we hit a fog. I remember the window was cracked because I was smoking a stogie. My friend was half asleep in the passenger seat but still conscious. I had just looked up from changing the song on my phone, and right in front of the car was what I can only describe as a shadow being. It was tall and stood on 2 legs. It had no color or details, just a black void in the shape of an upright silhouette. It was right in front of my headlight, too, and it still didn't show any detail. The thing about this whole experience that terrified me the most was that after it had passed us, it smacked the weeds and tall grass on the side of the road, and it made such a loud sound because of how fast it was moving. Hearing that noise after what I had just saw sent a chill down my spine. My friend and I didn't say much, except to confirm to ourselves that we had indeed seen what we had seen. An Appalachian shadow man. I've never seen something like that before or since. Please comment if someone has seen something like this. It would be interesting to get more insight on what I saw that night. Strange sighting in Texas, any ideas what it could be? We woke up to a strange text from my father-in-law, who lives near DFW, TX. At about 10:30 p.m. last night, he texted, "Either I just saw Batman or an angel while I took the dog for a walk now." My husband had a missed call from him, but we were both asleep last night and had no idea what he was talking about. So we called this morning, and he explained that last night, during the full moon, he was walking his dog. No one else was around, and he noticed a large, strange shadow on the ground and heard a soft swishing noise of wings. He looked up and saw what he described as a huge bird, but it had arms, which were held back along the body, which he said looked human. It had legs that had long shins and large talons for feet. He couldn't make out the shape of the head, but was so shocked he couldn't take a photo. His dog was also freaked out and tried to hide under a nearby car. For context, this is a man who was a rancher/hunter in the mountains of Patagonia most of his life. He's no stranger to animals, and he said he's never seen anything like this before. I did a little Googling, and it looks like there's been some similar sightings in Texas over the years, but I'm curious to find out more, and so is he. Any insights? My encounter/experience with a massive creature in the tree. About 8 years ago, my dad and I started delivering newspapers. We always started around 1 a.m. and didn't get done till around 7 a.m. Nothing odd happened the first few weeks. Yeah, it was creepy being out at that time, but also cool since it was so quiet. 2 separate incidents occurred while delivering newspapers. The first happened at this one customer's house that had a long-ass driveway that was dark as hell. Usually we could pull up by the porch and just throw the paper onto it, but sometimes she'd have her car in the way, so one of us would actually have to get out to deliver it. Nothing ever happened until 2 weeks into the route. I had put the paper on her porch. It was quiet out, and there was no wind, so I know it wasn't the wind I heard. As I was walking back, I heard this creature/whatever flapping its wings in the tree behind me. It sounded massive, bigger than an owl, a falcon, whatever. It sounded like it had these huge ass wings. I wasn't waiting around to find out what it was, and I made a run for the car. My dad asked me what was wrong, and I told him, but at the time he didn't believe me. My mind immediately went to a Mothman type creature. The creature that's been stalking me. Location, Michigan, downtown Sheboygan. Time, midnight, when I was at a bonfire yesterday at my mom's friend's house, and it started to get dark as I was walking around by the road. So, I start to use my flashlight on my phone and shine down the road, then boom, right on the side, a huge black mass just appears. It's got these 2 giant yellow eyes, and it's just staring me down. So I run back to the fire and sit down next to my mom and dad, looking over my shoulder. I then decide after a couple minutes of sitting to get back up and walk farther down the road, then turn on my light. As soon as I did, it was very close to me, so I got a very good look at its face and back. It's got this crest on its chin, kind of like a bearded dragon's beard, and fluffy black fur with a white bottom lip. When it turned and ran, I couldn't help but notice that this thing has huge butt cheeks. Like, they are giant, and it also has a small black tail. After this, it moved across the road and kept peeking out of the woods, just staring at us. I didn't tell anyone else, but I got so shocked and paranoid that my mom had me go in the house. End of day 1. So in the morning I decided to go on a walk at 9 a.m., and I brought my knife and phone just to be safe. So I go to the local river and just watch the stream and stand on the bridge. And then, like 2 hours later, when no one was around, the creature snuck up behind me and clawed my shirt right off, which sent it into the river and made me fall over, which then made me scrape my arm and knee really badly and my knife fall in while my phone was on the edge. After this, the thing pinned me down and snarled at my face. But as soon as it heard someone biking, it jumped away into someone's private property and disappeared. Some things I found out were, it has no nose, it's a guy, the back feet have an extra toe as opposed to the front, which has 4, the tail has white fur beneath it, the mouth of this thing can stretch very wide, its front teeth jet outwards like a set of spider mandibles, and it's tall and giant as hell. End of morning day 2. Later in the day, we returned to the person's house and enjoyed another bonfire. From 10 o'clock to 12:10 p.m. we were all hearing loud cracking and snapping from the woods, so I started to take pictures. This time, I caught its eye and tail in 2 pictures, and I showed my dad the pictures too. End of day 2. The only person who saw the full creature? Me. The only person to whom I showed the photos of this creature was my dad. Everyone heard it though. Skinwalker encounter. I don't know if a skinwalker counts as a cryptid, but this is my experience with one. When I was 6, my mother and I were driving around the back roads of East Tennessee to get back to our home after running errands. We were on a small road between 2 cattle fields surrounded by woods. The sky was clear and black, you could see a full moon and the stars if you looked up, not a cloud in the sky. But the trees in the forest started to shake, not like the wind was blowing, but like something large was running through them. You could hear the branches breaking and leaves shivering against each other. Before I knew it, this large, almost human-like being ran across the right side of the cow field. It was hunched over and running on all 4s. Its arms and legs were weirdly long and bony. It had the frame shape of a person, just taller, probably 9 to 12 feet tall, and it was larger in general. It had pale, pink skin sitting lazily on its unhealthy-looking skinny figure. Even on its skull, skin was stretched out over where you could obviously tell human features once were. It had skin stretched over sunken in eye sockets, and its mouth was grown over. The only part of its face that was open was an empty nasal cavity. I cannot stress enough that there was no meat, muscle, or fat on its body. The skin, which was tight and pale pink, was stretched over the bones. It ran on all 4s, hunched over, but was freakishly fast. It bolted across the right side of the cow field and jumped the fence like it wasn't there. As it passed out the car, it looked in through the windshield at me. Just as fast as it appeared from the woods on the right side, it was off the street, Fast enough for us to not slow down our car at 55 miles per hour, through the right side of the cow field, and into the right side of the woods. I have no backup or proof for this to be real. I do have a very active imagination, but I do know that when I screamed and my mom said what, I responded with, "Did you see that?" She asked if it was the pink flash across the road, and I said yes, but to me it was much more clear than that. Until we moved away from that area just 2 months ago, I saw it a few times. In the edge of the woods, or I could feel it watching. Sometimes I would hear it, following me from just inside the woodbine while I was there at night. I was out camping/hunting in October when it got dark, so I crawled into my tent for the night. I woke up to just one corner of my tent rattling as if someone had tied their dog leash to it and threw a stick. I first thought it was the wind, but the rest of the tent would be rattling too. I've had deer come up and kick my tent before, so I thought that's what was going on. I slapped my hand on the tent floor and yelled something like, "Get out of here," or something similar. The shaking stopped, but then the top of my tent was hit really hard by something. It broke one of the tent stakes even. Right afterwards, I heard this noise. I have trouble describing it exactly, but to me it resembles an elephant rumble, mixed with the noise of an older man getting out of a recliner. It was deep and oddly loud, as I felt the noise right in my ears. Now, I won't lie to you. At this point, I was shitting my pants. And kind of just laid there frozen stiff. After the noise, I thought I heard it walk off, but it was too faint or too distant to really tell. I remember laying there the rest of the night wide awake till the sun began rising. I packed up and hauled asses out of there. Never camped or hunted that spot again. I went back 4 times during daylight, and I feel nervous being there. I can't explain my encounter as I have no evidence other than a broken tent pole that I threw out, and I am hoping for a logical explanation to this because I don't want to say it was Bigfoot. I grew up watching Bigfoot shows and stuff, and I've grown to be a skeptic because I always try to find a logical explanation. But with my encounter, I just don't know. I was knocking doors, for my job, in a neighborhood between Montbello and Aurora. I was with a trainee, and we were knocking together as it started to get dark outside, 5 or 6 p.m. It was November. We walked up to a house that wasn't lit from the outside but had one of those motion sensor lights. As we approached the house, this thing came running from the side of the garage straight at us as we were walking up to the front door. It stood on 2 legs, was around waist high tall, and had long arms that hung almost down to the ground. They looked like tree branches. And the shape of the head looked very much like a cat but a little elongated. It was a very dark creature, like dark brown or black. The 2 of us screamed and watched the thing run past us and down the street and disappear behind a few trees. When it ran, it was loud like horse hooves on the pavement. I had goosebumps for the rest of the night, and this encounter left me with a tremendous amount of unease. We left the neighborhood quickly and refused to go back at night. Fast forward to a few months later in the summer, and I was talking to a woman in Park Hill who grew up in the area. Granted, we were talking about paranormal experiences, and when I described the thing I saw, she said, "I hate those things," and then told me about how she grew up in the neighborhood I was talking about and how those things, plural, would hang out in her backyard and basement and disappear in moments. Please, if anyone has any similar experiences in the Denver area, please share. I can't be crazy. That night, me and the trainee I was with saw the same thing. This other woman confirmed it months later. I still think about it to this day, and I cannot find any information about what these creatures are. Dog person encounter from my childhood. I had this encounter when I was 5 years old. I was living with my mother in an apartment in Tucson, Arizona. My mother worked as a waitress to pay our bills and provide a roof over my head and food for the fridge. She worked nights, and even though I was young, she gave me the responsibility of getting myself ready for bed. It was a full moon night in August. I lay awake in my bed. The window was open in order to cool off the room. I am not sure what had stirred me, but as I lay in bed, I looked around my bedroom. The light from the moon lit the entire room. I could see everything clearly and was looking around my room when I happened to notice the vent above my bedroom door. Just a standard vent for the air, nothing special, but while I was looking at it, a thick black smoke issued slowly out of it. It rolled out of the vent and onto the floor in front of the door. While I was watching, it took form. It became a woman's old-fashioned style dress. It had a bodice and a bell shape. The shoulders were puffed out, and the waist was thin where the bell went out into the floor. It was black, with white flowers patterned all over it. Like the old Victorian style dresses, it went all the way high on the neck. The head was not a human one. It looked like a black German shepherd. It was panting and facing to the right. As I watched, it slowly turned its gaze towards me. It was still panting, and I saw its eyes catching the reflection of the moon. I screamed in horror and rushed towards the light switch that was to the left of the door. After turning on the lights, it became thick black smoke again and issued back into the vent. It took several seconds for it to disappear into the vent after I had turned the lights on. I never saw anything like it again, and for many years after, I refused to sleep with the lights off. The thing in the woods. I wanted to explain a specific encounter I had. I'm not quite sure what it was. I had gotten into an argument with my mom about the hat man that was leaning over me while I slept on the couch, something my sister informed me of the following day. A lot of weird stuff happened at that house. But that wasn't the encounter. No, it was after the argument. I was walking out of the house down the road, where we were surrounded by woods, and a small swamp was behind our place. I was walking down the road, which was side to side in a wooded area. Not many people came down where we were. So I was listening to music while on my walk and I felt like something was watching me. I lived in Alabama, so it was weird. Nobody came in our woods. Not ever. I looked over, and there I saw it. It was hunched over and huge. It had pale features and was so skinny I could see its ribcage. The thing that took me off was its mask-like face. It didn't wear a mask, but its face had mask-like features. The only reason why I say its face wasn't wearing a mask was because I could see its mouth perfectly. It had dark eyes. I thought it had eye bags, but maybe because I was trying to reassure myself. I heard a branch crunch under its hands. I like to assure myself they were at least. It reminded me of a human, but all wrong. Please someone tell me they've got some explanation because I can't. Silver Creek Dogman. I don't care if you believe me or not. I was a witness to the creature known as Dogman, or Werewolf. In the autumn of 2013, the witness had not only one encounter but had a second sighting of an unusual, frightening being. The witness was working night shifts at the time, which meant he had to travel the dark roads in the sighting area on a regular basis. One night, as he was traveling down Johnson Road, which borders Silver Creek Metro Park, he abruptly stopped his car as two deer raced across the road heading south. What he saw pursuing them was attention-grabbing. I would place them somewhere between 6 feet 6 inches and 7 tall. They chased the two deer, which were both smaller, by the way, out across the street and into the woods. They ran, in formation, one in front, two behind, kind of next to each other. They were roughly 30 to 40 yards behind the deer. They were bipedal, very muscular, and fast, lightning fast. It all happened in just a few seconds. I couldn't describe any features, unfortunately. I'm assuming it was either a new moon or cloudy because it was very dark, but they were definitely a dark color. Maybe a chocolate brown or a black color. He was questioned if perhaps what he saw was a Bigfoot. There are many reported sightings of them in Ohio. Said the witness, they say that Bigfoot has long arms that swing when it runs, and it runs like a human. Whatever these were, they weren't Bigfoot. I can't describe how they moved, but they didn't move like a person. It was only a couple of weeks later when the witness was again heading home on Johnson Road. As he was driving past a cornfield, something ran out in front of his car. The fields had full-grown corn stalks, but I don't know the exact heights, only that the corn stalks were taller than me by a head, and I'm 6 feet tall. This time, my sighting of two creatures was a quick flash because there was no open land to it. They basically leapt the road as they broke the corn and landed about 10 to 15 feet into the field on the other side and kept running. This time, the pair that I saw in the moonlight, the first was black and the second was black with white or silver on its chest and back. Since the first three I saw were all a solid color, that means there must be at least 4 different creatures. Small fur-covered bipedal creatures. When I was 5 or 6 years old, in the mid-1980s, we resided in Rutland County, Vermont. There was a marshy area behind our house, separated by a small wooded area. I remember almost every night for about a couple of weeks, waking up to strange lights in the wooded area behind the house. My room was on the second floor of the house, facing the rear toward the wooded area, and I could just see the edge of the marshy area through the trees during the day. My parents' room was directly across the hall, facing the front of the house. I remember going into my parents' room and telling them about the lights, but my mom would always send me back to bed without checking. I got so scared that I'd hide under my bed when the lights were happening. Around this same time I started seeing small, bipedal creatures that stood about 2.5 feet tall with large, black eyes coming out of the woods and trying to get into the house. When I told my parents about them, they would say that they were just terrible dreams and not to worry. Almost every night, after seeing the lights, they'd come out of the marshy area or wooded area, try to get into the house, and I'd hide under the bed, too scared to do anything else. Eventually, the lights stopped, and they stopped coming out of the woods. My parents still think I was having recurring nightmares. Cryptid encounter, need more info. What happened? My wife and I are driving home from a fast food restaurant, taking a road we always take, nearly several times a day, because it is a shortcut. It's nighttime, of course. Seemingly out of nowhere, on the right side of the road, there is a small dog that looks like a husky but with really shaggy hair. It is staring downward at the swathe of road in front of it and appears not to notice the cars flying past. Here's the kicker, it had antlers. They were about twice the height of the dog, sticking straight up in the air and covered in white fur, the shade of the lightest parts of its fur. My wife and I both basically ducking scream, and as soon as we pass it, as soon as it leaves the view of the passenger side window, I look in the side view mirror, and it's not ducking there. Look behind us, it's not there. So we're losing our minds, like, did you see that? It had antlers. And we're freaking the duck out. I keep turning around to look in the back seat of the car because, although I don't know much about skinwalkers, I know something about spirits, and I know that sometimes they like to hop in the car with you as you pass them. We get like a quarter mile away and decide to turn back and investigate, drive past the spot where we saw it with all of the windows up. Well, there it is. It's lying down by the side of the road, licking up some roadkill. But the goddamn antlers are gone. We circle back again and inspect the side of the road, which is hilarious because we've driven on this road nearly every day, several times a day, for 3 years. There are no large sticks nearby that could explain the antlers. Furthermore, even if it were a stick, it would have to be a bleached white stick in the literal shape of antlers, and the climate we live in does not ever bleach sticks. There are no road signs, nothing around that could have possibly been mistaken for antlers. Needless to say, my wife and I both know what we ducking saw. We were not on any drugs or alcohol. It was as clear as day what we saw. So then the usual follows. A friend comes over to stay the night so that we're not completely terrified, we set the alarms and everything, and then we do a cleansing and protecting ritual as best as we can manage. Sage, cedar, palo santo, candles, crystals, pure gold, rosemary, dirt, written intentions, etc., and we just do everything we can think of for about an hour. When it's done, we all feel lighter and like we can breathe, and whether you believe it's placebo effect or psychosomatic manifestation, we felt better. Everybody we know says it was a skinwalker. My personal story. Here in North Texas, there is a cryptid known as the Lake Worth Monster or the Greer Island Goatman. This creature is said to roam Greer Island and the surrounding area near Lake Worth. Although this story doesn't take place at the lake, it takes place by another close lake. I'm not going to share this specific lake for privacy reasons. Anyway, when we were kids, my cousin, 8 male, lived by this lake, and my sister, 10, and I, 12 male, as well as his other cousin, 13, were invited over for the weekend. When we were over, we heard strange noises during the night, similar to an elk bugle. This was the loudest when my uncle drove us through the woodland on the shore. One night when staying up playing Animal Crossing, about 2012, New Leaf had just released, we heard these noises and looked out the window to see a gray, hairy humanoid figure with horns and hooves standing on his neighbor's roof. Needless to say, this was the most terrified I had ever been. After this, we just hid in his room, closed all windows and blinds, and then made a fort so we felt safer. We didn't get our aunt and uncle though because he had a baby brother that we did not want to disturb because we thought the crying would attract it. 2 nights ago, I had an encounter with something in the wooded areas around the lake, specifically the overlook. I tried to do my research on what it could have been. I came across encounters of other cryptids, like skinwalkers and Wendigo. However, the suburban nature of this encounter has led me to disqualify the possibility of it being either of those creatures, and its appearance and location have led me here. I don't know what it was, but it was something that felt human, but I know it couldn't have been a human. It felt too much like an animal. It still hit me like I was being watched by an animal. It just took longer for me to catch on than I usually do. So, I'm there off the main streets in the southwestern suburbs at the overlook, listening to music in my car. I often like to get out of the city to clear my head, and I feel like I heard something pulling up to me from behind. You know it's late, it's dark, and people like to come to the overlook to drink or find some privacy, so I check my rear view, and I see it in the moonlight. Something is in the shadows across the road up the hill, unsure of what it is. I move to adjust my mirror to get a better look when I see eyes like how animals have eyes that glisten in the dark. It's like that, but they're watching me through the rear view, transfixed, focused, intent like the ways people do in photographs. It looked like what I now imagine is the devil of some kind, tall and white as snow. It froze me in my place. It had straightforward eyes, like predators do. That's all I got to look at as it was slinked up against and behind the trees. My head, I guess, finally processes what I was seeing, and I get hit, like someone poured ice down my back, that feeling I get when someone is approaching me from behind or something is watching me. This sends me bugging out into panic, so I shift into drive and hook a right forward, and out of the lot back onto the main road. Running along the hill, I speed up and head forward. I just drive till I hit the main road with street lights again and don't stop until I get back out of the surrounding preserves area. The eyes felt so human, but it felt impossible for someone to be out there, but I know it just couldn't have been an animal because when I'm out in the preserves, it never felt like that when I was among deer or the other animals that I know are out there. It felt like it was wrong, like it was invading the space, but it didn't feel like a person I know when they are around. I keep my guard up, but whatever it was flew beneath my senses and fit into the dark. I don't know what it was, but it made me feel so sick that I was there, and I missed it. I didn't know until I fully registered something was out there with me. I don't know what it was, but if anyone has any idea that could give me any better understanding, please. A very strange, tall creature was seen in the woods. Me and my friend have been recently taking walks around our neighborhood just to get some fresh air. Today we walked back near an interstate bridge to a place that looked like a dead-end dirt road. We got back to the end of the dirt road, and it connected to the interstate with trees in front of it. As we looked around, there seemed to be a lot of other people's stuff, literally like someone took all of their house belongings and threw them back here. We keep walking about 5 more feet and find a more woods-like trail with tire tracks on it, which led for miles ahead it looked like. We walked about 30 more seconds in and saw something very tall and super blurry but dark and recognizable. As soon as we saw it, it shifted sideways without turning and covered our entire field of view in less than a second easily, making no noise. The only noise it made was from a branch about 7 to 8 feet in the air from the ground on a tree. This is very strange, and I was wondering if anybody knows anything about it. Thanks. I'm very scientific and extremely skeptical. In every situation, I try to rationalize my way out of thinking supernatural. But, in this instance, there is no conclusion that makes sense to me. I grew up in the 90s in California in the high desert in a very ugly little place called Victorville. Back in the 90s, it was pretty desolate, and there were huge swaths of undeveloped land. In between the houses were many empty lots. The street I lived on didn't have street lamps, but at dusk you still had decent visibility because even though the sun set, the sky would be bright for another hour. I grew up with my grandmother and my father and sister-in-law in a very small house. And whereas the house was lacking, the garden wasn't. We had an H-shaped driveway, and when looking out, my front door to the left end of the driveway was where we kept our trash bins. Near there we had some shrugs, a spindly tree, and some iris. When this happened, I was 7 years old, and my dad told my sister to take the trash out. She made a stink about it, so to keep the peace, I said I'd do it. Let me state now that I wasn't scared of the dark. It was a normal night. There was nothing on my mind. When I grabbed the bag I opened my front door, walked out, turned around to close it, and then faced the trash bins across the front yard. When I looked over there was a tall, dark figure near the bins, and when I saw it, it turned and looked at me and straightened up. But it didn't just turn its head. It swung its torso around to face me and lifted its head. Straightened up, it was 6 to 7 tall, and the thing that scared me was it didn't move like a person would, and the eyes when facing me were reflective. Kind of like cats' eyes when they catch the light. I frozen holding the trash bag on my front step, and I literally just set the bag down and turned right around and went back inside. I told no one what I saw because I knew they'd make fun of me. I just froze with absolute fear, and I knew there was no way I was walking towards it. Norwegian Skinwalker. Alright, before I want to begin, I want to say that a Hamløper is a Norwegian Skinwalker. The only real difference is that a Skinwalker is Native American, whereas a Hamløper is not. It was only 2 days ago as of when I wrote this. Me and a buddy were driving around, just fishing and having fun. I was the designated driver for my girlfriend, who was out drinking with a colleague. I did not care to join them when I could rather spend my time doing something important, fishing. Around 23.40, I suggested to my buddy that we should go fishing in Rocajon, which is a small lake only about 40 to 50 minutes away. It was pitch black on a moonless night as we drove towards the lake. About 5 minutes after we passed a gas station, we entered a forest, a thick, deep, dark pine forest. A little ahead, we noticed a road deer standing completely still on the side of the road. It looked sick, skinny, and almost dead-like. We thought nothing of it and kept on driving. When we arrived at the lake, we stepped out of the car, and the first thing we noticed was how quiet everything was. No birds, no insects, just completely black and quiet. We rigged our gear and walked out to a small bridge and started fishing. I suddenly got this eerie feeling of someone watching me, analyzing my every move. The air started feeling thick, and it smelt like rotting flesh all around me, a sickening, Sweet smell. The wind started to pick up and the trees and bushes started rustling, but I could clearly hear something moving in the trees, something big, something fast. I felt chills running down my spine, and I decided we needed to leave. I packed my stuff and began to walk along the little path. I still heard something following me. We got to the car, and I was white as a sheet. My friend asked me if I was okay. He hadn't heard or smelled anything. As we were loading our stuff into the car, a loud crack sounded from the tree line just 15 feet from us. It sounded like someone snapping a tree in half. I spun around and shone my flashlight into the trees. What I saw shook me to my core. In some trees, I saw a huge humanoid creature hunched over but still 6 feet tall. It was pale and thin, its arms could stretch across the whole length of my car. Its face was just wrong, no ears, no hair, no eyebrows, huge yellow eyes, and a way too big grin with razor-sharp gray decaying teeth. Me and my buddy looked at each other and threw ourselves into the car. I started it, smashed it into gear, and raced off. I went 60 to 70 miles per hour down this small forest road. I slowed down after maybe 15 minutes, and by the side of the road we saw that same sick deer. But this time it was even more wrong, like someone had bent the deer in the middle. We went back to the city and fished more in the boat harbor. We got 2 small perch. What did we encounter? We don't know what we saw. A friend and I were out smoking on his porch. The porch is facing a warehouse across the street. One of us happened to look up on top of the warehouse and spotted something standing on the ledge. We couldn't make out any details besides its form. It looked like a person standing there looking down. We were both kind of freaked out because why would anyone be standing up there at 10 at night? But there wasn't any kind of feeling of danger or anything like that. It was just there. We went back inside for a while trying to figure out what it was. We went back out, and it was still there. It stayed for a few hours, then left when we were inside. Next night we went to see if it was there and it wasn't, so we continued to BS for a bit. Then my buddy gasped because he saw it fly down from behind a tree to perch on the same ledge it was on the night before. It remained there for another few hours. We never saw it leave. It kept showing up for a week or so, then we never saw it again. We even looked at it through binoculars and couldn't see anything at all. No details, just a black shadow. We are going crazy trying to figure out what the duck it was. It stood at least 5 to 7 feet tall, at least 1.5 feet wide, and looked like Batman standing on a ledge. We named it Batman just because there's no other way to describe how it looked. Location: South Central Pennsylvania. My siblings and I encountered a monster in our backyard. My older sister was babysitting. We heard a loud noise. It sounded like one of the horses had gotten out and was pressing against the hanging barn door. Anyone who has a barn knows that loud rattle. My sister went out to the back porch, and there wasn't anything near the barn. But she froze. "Oh my God," she says. My other sister and I ran out to the back porch, and the 3 of us watched this thing cross the garden. It was covered in long hair, light brown. It was on all 4s and moved in a galloping motion. As it approached the back fence, which represented its only escape, it rose and began to run on its hind legs. When it got to the barbed wire fence, it jumped in such a way that was so startling all 3 of us screamed. The shape of it was human except its knees did not bend in the same direction as a human's. The hair was long and sweeping, not like a deer or other large animal, which we saw plenty of out there. The eyes were jet black. We ran back inside and called our parents. It was not a cool, fun event, it was terrifying. We were afraid for our lives. The next morning we went out with my dad to look at the garden. Crops were taken, disturbed, and the tracks were mixed. We could see prints in the mud that looked like human hands minus a thumb, but then there were also these deep hoof prints. This all happened, and I share the story often. I don't care if anyone else believes me, and I'm happy to die on this hill. The little people of northern Minnesota. For the past several months, Crypto Four Corners International founder and researcher J.C. Johnson has been in northern Minnesota, near the Canadian border, investigating several cryptid encounters and phenomena reported by local residents. One of these cryptids is a race of small humanoids known by the indigenous Ojibwa as Bagwajawinini or wild man. Other bands have different names for them, including Apayans or Payans, which mean little person. The Bagwajawinini are described as 2-3 in height, with a greenish complexion, most likely from the heavy ingestion of plants containing chlorophyll. They live in a darkened world of thick bracken fern canopies that can grow up to 3 feet high. This enables the Bagwajawinini to freely roam among the forest and its edges without detection. There have been many stories associated with the Bagwajawinini, including the possibility of human abduction. The legends regarding these creatures almost uniformly state that it is best, if one sights these creatures, to just leave it alone and go away. In Massachusetts, there have been several historical and recent sightings of the Pukwudgie and even what some consider attacks. These small creatures have been blamed for some local suicides and disappearances as well. Hockomock Swamp is locally noted by people who live in Massachusetts for being just a flat-out creepy, swampy, mucky geographical location. It is a very thick, soupy bog and was considered by the local Native Americans to be a cursed evil land. A man by the name of William Russo wrote in his blog, then later in his book The Creature from the Bridgewater Triangle, and Other Odd Tales from New England, his own personal account with these creatures. He was walking his dog near his home around midnight, which happens to be just south of the Hockomock Swamp, when a 3 to 4 foot creature came just about 10 feet in front of him and his dog. The creature was first seen by Russo just under a streetlight and was said by him to be trying to vocalize words and was even beckoning him to come closer. This man, Russo, said, "I had never heard of the Pukwudgies until Aaron Kidue interviewed me for his documentary on the Bridgewater Triangle. As the Wampanoag Pukwudgie story goes, a good giant had dispersed the nasty Pukwudgie creatures far and wide, and the more benign of the bunch decided to take up residence in the northern Midwest." During the investigation, international C4C researcher Ron Shaw interviewed an Ojibwa woman who stated that on one occasion, her son saw a Bagwajawinini playing a flute. Another witness, an Ojibwa man, stated that he and his son were hunting and, at one point, were separated. The father tracked his son to the root system of a tree, where only his legs were sticking out. He pulled his son free, and told his father that the Bagwajawinini captured him and were taking him underground. The Ozark Howler, a Midwestern folktale. Here's some light research I've put together on a cryptid and local legend of the Ozarks, the Ozark Howler. Also known in folklore as the Nightshade Bear, Hoo-Hoo, and the Devil Cat. The howler is said to be a black shaggy beast with strange abilities, red eyes, and a horrific howl that makes a man's blood run cold. The sound is said to be an eerie hybrid of an elk's bugle, human screaming, and the cackle of a hyena. Some versions of the creature are bear-like, while others are more cat-like. Sometimes the Ozark Howler is reported to have horns like a ram or goat. Stories of the creature originated when hunters, trappers, and farmers settled the land now known as the U.S. Interior Highlands. The settlers of the Ozarks would tell each other stories of haunting howls echoing through the valleys and bluffs. An account of Daniel Boone, the legendary frontiersman, tells of him hunting and killing an Ozark Howler while exploring Missouri. Another interesting but unrelated anecdote, Daniel Boone claimed to have shot a hairy wild man while exploring Kentucky. Is there any validity to these stories of a beast in the Ozarks? In my opinion, this could be a fascinating blend of mistaken identity and European superstition. Historically, and today, many types of fauna call the Ozarks home: deer, elk, red wolves, coyote, red fox, gray fox, bobcat, turkey, black bear, and mountain lion. There are some obvious parallels between the black bear, the mountain lion, and the Ozark Howler. If you search images of the Ozark Howler online, most images are very reminiscent of either a bear or, albeit melanistic, mountain lion. Even the creature's eerie howls could be explained by elk, coyotes, red wolves, foxes, or mountain lions. All of which can have strange, almost otherworldly vocalizations. Now for the superstition angle. Traditional Ozark folklore claims the creature's red eyes can put people in a trance. Another legend tells of the blood-curdling howl being an omen of death. Other tales warn of seeing the howler before you die. If you have some passing knowledge of the folklore of the British Isles, you've no doubt heard of the black dog. Also known as black shuck, old shuck, or hellhounds. It is depicted as black, with red eyes and a transfixing gaze. Like the Ozark Howler, the black dog is a bad omen. In Scottish, Irish, and English folklore, those who see the dog are expected to have an untimely end. Some also thought the dog was merely a companion to travel with the dead to the afterlife. Hence the moniker hellhound. Here's the cool part. Most of the settlers from the Ozarks are of Scottish, Irish, and English descent. I believe the Ozark Howler is the legend of the black dog seen through a filter of the American frontier. Early settlers of the Ozarks were from the Carolinas and Tennessee areas of the Appalachians. The settlers of the Appalachians were from the British Isles. I think it's possible they carried some of their superstitions and myths into America. Seeing black bears and possibly, melanistic mountain lions and subconsciously merging them into their own ghost stories and folk tales of the black dog. Add in the eerie howls and vocalizations of natural Ozark fauna, and now we have the Ozark Howler. Two sides of the same coin. One is a ghostly hound of the foggy moors, and the other is a legendary beast that haunts the hills and hollers of Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. I believe I encountered the Mothman in August of 2005. I was 19. I visited Point Pleasant with my friend and fiancé. We were just dumb kids being dumb kids and thought it would be fun to go find the Mothman. We didn't even plan the trip out very much. We borrowed this old tent that belonged to my fiancé's father, and I swear to God it hadn't been opened since the 70s. When we made it into town, it was already dark. We stopped at a police station, and they were friendly enough and told us where we could camp. We went down all these creepy back roads, and it seemed so dark and isolated. We were having a good time, pretending to scare the shit out of each other, as kids do. We were driving down one back road just surrounded by woods. It was completely dark other than the headlights. And we all three saw two enormous red eyes in the sky. I know how it sounds. But it, honest to God, happened, and we all about pissed ourselves because of how high off the ground they were. We all three screamed like little girls, and my fiancé floored it. After the initial shock and just feeling shaky and unnerved, my fiancé recovered and wanted to set up camp. My friend and I thought he was an idiot, and we refused to sleep anywhere near those woods. We ended up sleeping in the car in a hospital parking lot once we were back to civilization. We later found out the directions to the camping spot we got were in/around the TNT area. We had no prior information about this. We barely planned it all. We had breakfast at Biscuit World the next morning and, for whatever reason, chose not to share our encounter with anyone. I guess we thought no one would believe us if we did. We left a day early since we didn't want to try sleeping in the car in August again. When we got home, Hurricane Katrina had made its way toward the Gulf Coast. It was all over the news. We had listened to mixed CDs the whole trip and hadn't even been aware of anything going on. It just struck me, because a Mothman sighting is said to be an omen of tragedy and misfortune. It's still this crazy story. I tell people, and they laugh, but what happened stays with me. Be careful what you go looking for, kids. You just might find it. Not deer? I have a few. But the most unsettling happened in a little town in Michigan just 30 minutes above the Ohio border. Me and my boyfriend were driving through old country roads at night. It was pretty late and no stores were open, but we didn't want to go home yet. It wasn't uncommon for us to just drive and listen to music. That night we were on an old dirt road just talking and using GPS to guide us home. We were lost. It was a game for us to get as lost as we could then find our way back, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I slammed on my brakes. I don't even remember seeing them, nor did my brother, but suddenly there were these three huge deer in front of our car. I drove a pretty large car at the time, a lifted sun, and these deer were looking down at me through the windshield. I didn't remember seeing them walk onto the road or even knowing to stop. Suddenly my foot was just on the brake, and then they were there. They were way bigger than normal deer, and my boyfriend recalls they had pupils, black pupils that were surrounded by a reflective blue, and they just stared us down. I turned my lights on to try and scare them away, but they stood their ground. After about 2 minutes of staring, the taut deer with large antlers walked across the road, never breaking eye contact and almost turning his head 180 degrees to stare until me and my partner drove away as fast as my 2001 car would take us. It wasn't until we got home that we started to recollect on other odd features the deer possessed. Elongated faces, puffed out cheeks like how a dog conceals teeth. Long fur, much longer than you see on deer normally up here. It was overall a frightening experience, but only one of many we had with deer on those roads. The Black Stick Man phenomenon. I have always denied anything supernatural, but this experience changed my view of the world. I am now obsessed with reading people's stories or anything new that has been shared about these things specifically. Here is my story to share with all you open-minded folk. I live just off the Isle of Skye in Scotland. In the village where I live, there's 2 bridges linking the mainland to Skye. Between the bridges is a wee island that has a lighthouse and 2 cottages going back hundreds of years. Famously, Gavin Maxwell resided in one of them. Anyway, there's always been a lot of folklore around the lighthouse. Everyone who has worked there over the centuries has always said the same story. Which is that they heard loud voices calling loudly outside the building and a massive change in atmosphere. One night in the spring of 2019, I was running the Skye Bridge after work at around 9 p.m. I stopped to take rest on the first smaller bridge between the cottages and the mainland. The bridge was in complete darkness, and I was using my torch to see where I was going. I leaned on the barrier to catch my breath, looking out over the moonlit loch. When I turned my head and looked in the direction of the distant street lights about 100 meters or so away, I was utterly stunned. The hairs stood up all over me, and my nerves were shot to pieces. I locked my eyes on what seemed to be a 12-foot giant blurry stick figure crossing the road. The figure was nearly as tall as the street lights. It had no features other than see-through shades of dark blue and black. Its legs and arms were the same long, thin shape of its body, as was its tall, featureless, squared head. What's more disturbing is the millisecond I saw it. I felt an overwhelming feeling of vulnerability and dread. It was a dramatic change in the air and a very terrible atmosphere. The scariest part for me was that when I watched this thing cross the road from the right side of the road, my side, to left. It took long, smooth, slow strides and didn't seem to contact the ground. It glided with its steps. When it reached the other side, it went through the stone wall that follows along the road, into the darkness, and then instantly reappeared back on my side. It then proceeded to cross the road over and over. This happened around 5 times until it never reappeared. This is the only thing I've ever witnessed in my life I cannot explain, and it utterly shocked me to my core, and now I really am just mesmerized. There really are weird things going on in the world. Since that day, I've been extremely nervous about passing through there. It's always in the back of my mind, even when I drive to work in daylight. If anyone here has had a similar experience, please let me know. I had never even heard of anything like this before. Not ever a bloody, slender man. Then I found online that people have had incredibly similar experiences to me. That made it crystal clear in my mind that I really had seen something, and it couldn't be a coincidence. I've been fascinated ever since. Thank you. Skinwalkers or some other type of shapeshifting human. Work as border patrol on probably the most remote and rugged part of the southern border. Rocky high desert mountains and forests. If you don't know what we do, essentially we track footprints for a living. The first really creepy story I know of is that a really skilled coworker of mine had been working in this canyon with extremely steep and rugged walls. There's one way in and one way out. As he was heading out because some agents deeper in the canyon had caught the group they were chasing, he passed an extremely old white man on horseback with long white hair. This area was on a private ranch, and we're familiar with the rancher's family and his hands. My coworker didn't recognize him, and after talking to others afterwards, no one else at the station could think of anyone meeting that description. Furthermore, while this area is in close proximity to a national forest, getting to this particular area would take quite some expertise and familiarity, as well as trespassing, or absolutely the worst luck getting lost I've ever heard of. When the agent passed the man in the canyon, he told him to be aware that agents would be escorting the group through the canyon to a point where they could be transported by vehicle back to the station. After communicating this, the man just looked at him and said, "Do you believe in Jesus?" And the agent replied, "Yes, sir, I do." The man then silently handed him a folded up piece of paper, and the agent placed it in his pocket without looking at it before carrying on. So the agent continued on until he made it back to the northern entrance to the canyon, thinking it was a little bit of a strange encounter, but some of these isolated ranchers and ranch hands are just socially different. Back at the road, he greeted the transporting agents who had been waiting with vans for several hours and told them about the man he had met. Both of the agents responded that it was strange because neither of them had seen the rider enter the canyon. Once the apprehending agents made it to them with a group of illegal aliens, he told them the same story, and the agents replied that they never passed the rider. Again, the only ways into and out of this canyon are from the southern entrance and the northern exit. The agent never found the price of paper given to him to read. The other story I have is from similarly skilled coworkers who were attempting to apprehend a single man who had passed one of our cameras at approximately 2 a.m. The agents both thought it was strange because the man on camera wasn't wearing camouflage typical of illegal alien traffic in our area. But even more so, the man had no backpack or water. Agents were able to make it to the camera fairly quickly. Like 30 minutes, if I remember correctly. This spot has excellent dirt for tracking, and I've worked dozens of groups in that area. As the 2 agents were following the footprints, all of a sudden the footprints just stopped. Vanished. But suddenly there were bear prints on the same line. About 15 minutes later, a bear sets off the same camera but heading in the opposite direction. The agents looked over that whole area and never found the human footprints again. But they also never found where the bear footprints entered the area. By the evidence in the dirt, it looked like a man had suddenly become a bear. Now I've tracked many groups where I suddenly lost the sign and had cattle or deer signs all over the area where the group should have been walking, but never anything as strange as that. For those groups, I'm typically much farther behind them, and so animals have had plenty of time to travel in the same area. Or the terrain becomes more rocky and difficult. But the area the agents were in is not at all like that. Neither was the timeline. 3 possible encounters with a Sasquatch. I live in Ohio, and the last known sighting around the part where I live hasn't been in like 25 years. The first possible encounter happened 12 years ago while staying in my aunt's camper on her property for the weekend while the local tractor pulls were going on. There was this box truck next to the camper, which played into this encounter in a bit. It was around 1 a.m. when this happened. We had gotten back to the camper after the last session for the Saturday session ended. It was just my dad, my sister, and myself staying for the weekend. We were about to go to bed when a bunch of dogs from the neighborhood started barking and growling out of nowhere, almost like they had all seen or heard something. Well, about 15 seconds later, we hear this deep, loud guttural growl come from near the box truck. The barking stopped, but it sounded like the dogs were whimpering when what I assume was a big rock got thrown at the box truck next to us. Like this thing was mad at us or trying to scare us. I assume it left because nothing happened after that. It unnerved all three of us, and we had a hard time getting to sleep. The second encounter was when I'm sure I saw a juvenile Sasquatch. This was about 9 years ago when we lived in the same town where my aunt lived in a mobile home park. There were some shady-ass people who lived in the park, so I always did a perimeter check around our trailer just for peace of mind. As I was going towards the back, I was looking at the empty space behind the trailers when I saw this shadow blocking out the light. It looked about as tall as me, but I could clearly see its head and could make out the body. It looked kind of stocky. I didn't wait to find out if it was going my way, so I went back around when I heard it let out a growl similar to the first encounter, but it wasn't as deep. I thought that was it, but the next day I found a massive dent in the door to our little storage shed behind our trailer. It looked like something big had kicked in the lower right-hand corner of the door. I feel like that served as a warning of some sort but never had anything happen there again. The third encounter was when I was camping for a few months during the summer about 7 years ago. The state park was pretty much empty except for us, a few people in the back part, and one other camper in the front, as it was getting close to the off-season. I had my own tent and my parents had theirs. Nothing ever really happened except we'd hear this creature up in the tree screeching/screaming away on occasion. It'd go for about 20 minutes, and it would happen for nights in a row but never in the same tree, then it would subside for about a week. First we heard it in the trees behind us the first night, then in the trees to the right of us the next night, then the trees on the other end of the campground the third night, then on the fourth night it would come from across the road. That's not the oddest thing. We had an ice chest outside between our tents, but nobody ever bothered it. The night before I had my encounter, my dad said he woke up to the sound of someone or something going through our cooler, then it shut the lid. The odd thing was this person or creature didn't take anything. The next night I'm still up watching a movie on my little TV and DVD player when I hear the cooler being opened up. I froze immediately because I didn't know what or who was out there. It closed the cooler, and I thought it was over, but that's when this creature put its big ass hand on the side of my tent. I watched it push the T-wall in a little and could see the outline of its hand. This went on for about probably 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. I'm led to believe it was a Sasquatch, as I've read up on them, and it seems like that's something a juvenile Sasquatch would do. They're just curious but didn't want to take anything or cause trouble. Giant, weird-looking creature that flies. Am I the only one that's seen someone like this? When I was about 9 years old, I was outside on a misty October night at about 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. There was a full moon or almost full moon, but it was all cloudy, so the sky was kind of a dark brownish gray. It's hard to describe the exact color, but I'm sure a lot of you know what I mean. Dark, but you can still see. If it wasn't for the fact that the sky wasn't pitch black, I wouldn't have seen this. Anyway, I was bouncing on my trampoline, and all of a sudden, I caught a glimpse of something flying toward my house just barely over the trees. I looked up as it got closer, and for a lack of better ways to describe it, it turned out to be a huge creature with a body kind of like a wide beetle and a giant squid's head combined. The creature's head was really small compared to its massive body. It had 4 pointed tentacles on each side of its body. It didn't have wings, it just hovered right over me and my house silently at maybe 20 to 30 miles an hour. Pretty fast but slow enough for me to make out the creature. I couldn't see its eyes or any detailed features besides the pointed ends of its tentacles, just the black silhouette as it flew over. It didn't bother me at all, and I'm not sure it even saw me, but obviously I went inside after that and didn't go out to play at night for a long time. Has anyone else seen something like this? And if you had an interaction with it, what was it like? Luckily, the creature was only over my yard and house for a second as it flew over, but I feel like I dodged a missile that night when I look back at it now. A really good Mothman sighting by 2 witnesses. I received the following email from a woman in Ohio who expressed concerns about a sighting she and her girlfriend had 6 months prior to the report. She stated that she substituted their names for anonymity. Megan affirms that all other details, location, date, and description of the incident, are factual. Witness Megan. I am forwarding a summary of an experience that I and a friend had in August 2010. My friend and associate Kira and I traveled from Columbus, Ohio, to Ravenswood, West Virginia, on business. While we were there, I wanted to make a side trip to Gallipolis, Ohio, in order to visit relatives I had not seen for quite a while. After our meeting and presentation, we drove onto Ohio Route 7 and traveled south along the Ohio River toward Gallipolis. We had a nice, though brief, visit with my relatives. Around 6 p.m., we left their home and drove a few miles north on Route 7 to check into a hotel near the local airport. Around 7:30 p.m., we decided to get dinner and found a quiet restaurant so we could eat and work. After we finished, Kira needed to go to the store and pick up a few items that she forgot to pack. We headed to a Walmart that was nearby the restaurant. After we finished shopping, we were walking to the car when I noticed a woman running through the parking lot. When she reached her car, she looked back in the direction of the store, then hurriedly got into the car. I quickly looked in the same direction and saw what looked like a large bird flying above the roof of the store. It was difficult to see, but when it swooped downward, the parking lot lights would shine off of it. It looked like it was either oily or had shiny leather-like skin. Whatever it was, it had a wide wingspan. I would guess it reached 8 to 10 feet across. It circled above the store for about a minute, then just disappeared. We were both somewhat shocked at what we witnessed but figured that it was just a huge bird. Since it was dark, I figured we had misjudged what it really was. We drove back to the hotel and decided to call it a night so we could get an early start on the drive home in the morning. I got ready for bed but thought I'd watch some television first. By this time it was around 10 p.m. or so. I must have dozed off fairly quickly because the next thing I remember is frantic knocking on my door. I stumbled out of bed and checked who it was. It was Kira, and she was obviously upset. She rushed into my room and said, "It's here. What are you talking about?" A little bit perturbed that she woke me up. She said that she was lying on the bed reading when she heard something in the hallway. She got out of bed, walked to the door, and listened to what she thought was scratching sounds. After a few minutes, the sound stopped, so she went back to bed. Not long after she lay down, she heard more scratching sounds, but from outside her window. Again, she got up and peeked through the curtains. This time, something looked back at her. Our rooms were on the second floor in the back section of the hotel, and both looked out onto a small parking lot and a large field beyond that. She could see what she described as a bald ugly man with wings who was looking directly at her with large bulging eyes that lit up bright red. It was there for only a few seconds. It then spread its wings while running at the same time towards the end of the parking lot and lifted off the ground like a bird. "You're kidding, right?" I muttered to her. "Meg, I swear to God, that thing is out there, and it knows we saw it." I knew the only way I was going to get some sleep was to allow Kira to stay in my room. The next morning we woke early, checked out, and drove back to Columbus. Kira didn't mention the incident from the previous night during the ride. In fact, she has still never said anything else about it. We continue to be close friends and have a fantastic working relationship. But I got curious. I had never heard of the Mothman or its legends. I grew up in Texas and had only lived in Ohio for a few years. I moved into my mom's house after she had passed away. Her relatives lived throughout Ohio, but I had never been told any of the stories. This is the reason I am writing to you. We were near Point Pleasant, West Virginia, when we had this encounter. Do you think that it is possible that this was a Mothman? I live in the Puget Sound area of northwest Washington state. Near my home is an area called Silver Lake, tucked away behind some of the homes and businesses. Near there is an expansive woodland/hiking area with dense trees and foliage, a few abandoned buildings, and large culvert structures. Among the densely forested area is a single dirt road where there is a recovery center, formerly a mental asylum far off from the beaten path. This dirt road was the only way in or out of this building. I wholeheartedly believe that this entire area is under some kind of curse or that something evil resides in these woods. I had an experience there that changed my life and truly turned me from a skeptical, hardhead to a cautious believer in the paranormal. I was hiking in this area about a year ago. I had gone to take photographs of the old mental asylum, turned recovery center, for an architecture class. At one point I had gotten hopelessly lost when I had turned down a wrong path on the public trail. I had wandered around aimlessly trying desperately to find the trail's head again for about 2 hours when I'd noticed it had gotten dark quickly. Once I had familiarized myself with the gravel road, I started to use my cell phone as a flashlight so I could see my way. It seemed to be getting dark to the point where the only illumination was coming from my phone's flashlight. It seemed for some reason to be eerily quiet as well. I felt so alone and heavy that I didn't want to stay there at all. I felt like something was watching me. Stalking me. Like prey for a cat, as your role as the mouse, you're just to be toyed with until your inevitable demise once the beast is bored. I heard absolutely nothing. No wind, no leaves rustling, no birds chirping. I could hear only one thing. My heart is beating uncontrollably at a fever's pace. I felt scared, sad, heartbroken, depressed, and as if the darkness around me was a cell. I felt like crying and sitting on the ground. All at once I heard shuffling behind me, as if something was approaching very quickly and about to collide with me. In this area of the Northwest, cougars are not uncommon. My belief was that if I had turned and yelled as loud as I could, whatever was approaching me would hopefully be scared off. When I had turned and began to yell, there was nothing there behind me but what seemed like a dirt cloud. My stomach dropped, and I just ran as hard as I could down the dirt path. While I was running, I could see something pursuing me at superhuman speed. It ran in a snapping and static-like motion in long bending strides. It looks as though walking was both effortless and painful. It had large yellow eyes that made up close to 45% of its face, no mouth, and cuts all over its body. The body itself was extremely slender and above average human height. Its slim and emaciated arms were long enough to reach well below its knees. Its flesh was sickly gray and was covered in a matted, thinning, wispy fur. Its eyes began to glow as if calling me towards it. I yelled as I ran for anyone to help me. There were no houses on site at the time. I began to pray to myself and try anything to stay calm as I ran down the dirt path so that I could maintain my footing and keep on the road. When I looked up to see what was ahead of me, I saw it perched near a street sign at the end of the dirt path where it met the road. The only road in or out. When I looked into its eyes, I felt like there was no point in living anymore. I felt very suicidal, and I didn't know what to do. The only thought I had was to call my father. In order for me to do that, I had to turn the flashlight off on my phone. I had quickly turned off the light and tried to call my dad on the phone. When I looked at my phone screen, I realized that my battery percentage had dropped from 80% to now a mere 10%. I began to panic. I called my dad once. No answer. I called him again, still running for my life. No answer. I called again. At this point, I begin to wonder if I'll see my son. If I'll get to see my wife again? Am I about to die? How is this happening? My dad answers the phone. I began bawling my eyes out and shouting in relief. I yelled to him, "Please come pick me up by any means necessary. I'm on this street, and I need you now." Knowing how calm I usually am, my dad, hearing the fear in my voice, stayed on the phone with me as he bolted to the car. My phone has 8% left on the battery. I'm still yelling at my dad on the phone, desperately pleading for his help. I began describing to him the monster stalking me and how I didn't want to die. The only thing I can remember him saying is, "That's why we don't go up here at night." My blood froze. At the same time, I could hear my dad pressing the gas harder in the car as he sped to my location. I couldn't move. I can barely breathe. I continued running as hard as I could. I saw a house in the distance and sprinted to it, seeing that the lights were on and the garage door was open. I yelled for help, and a kind, elderly gentleman came out of the garage door. Seeing how visibly shaken I was, he offered me a seat inside his garage. Fearing I'd be seen as a lunatic by this gentleman, I kept the description of the beast to myself for the time being. I also began fearing that my dad knew something more than he was telling me, or at least feared he would think that I was crazy. While waiting for my dad to pull into the driveway of this gentleman's home, the gentleman offered me some tea. We attempted some small talk, though I'll admit it was hard to focus on anything, but I still appreciated his attempt to help me calm down. The man stopped speaking at one point and asked for my attention directly. "I have a quick question for you. When you were out there in the woods, did you happen to come across anything unusual?" I couldn't catch my breath. I remember him grabbing a sketch album and asking, "You think you could look this over and see if it's what you'd seen?" He turned one of the sketches he'd done of a creature, much like the beast if just seen. My heart rate was out of control, I couldn't breathe, and my stomach dropped through the floor. I began to sweat and fainted. I woke up in my dad's car, and the only thing he's said since then is this: "The ground there is black. It's never been light. It'll break your back if you're found at night. Stay clear of the cursed rock, go through and don't look back." Since then we've never spoken of it. I've contacted local spirit and supernatural investigatory teams as well. No one would take up my case. I've lost relationships, friends, and contact with my family in some cases simply because I stated what I had seen and didn't stay quiet. I believe the only way I made it out of there alive is because I could only think if I had hurt myself or had stayed there, my son would have no one. I seriously believe there is something evil in those woods. My 2 uncles and a skinwalker. My family and I are Native Americans from the Navajo tribe. So we have a lot of strange, unexplainable things happen to us involving skinwalkers. This is one of many stories. This happened 4 months ago. My uncle Andre lives alone in a trailer park with his older brother David, who lives right next door to him. That night before, Andre was watching TV when he heard something. He said it sounded like someone running up and down his house. He listened to it for a while before he texted my uncle David to look out at his house to see if he saw something. When David looked out, he said he saw something like a man running on Andre's house. David, being a fearless older brother, ran out just in time to see a black shadow jump 11 or maybe 13 feet to the ground. He followed it until he stopped at a tree line, where he lost it. He had a flashlight with him and shined the light till he saw reflected eyes looking back at him. The figure looked like it was crouching down, trying to hide from David. He then heard a sound to his side. For a second, he looked toward the sound before snapping his head back at the figure to find it gone. Whatever it was, no normal creature could jump up and down 11 or 13 feet off the ground and onto a trailer without a ladder or breaking its legs. The creature of North Carolina. When I was in my early 20s, I experienced a supernatural event that to this day has left me shaken to my core and believing we are truly not alone in this universe. This happening occurred during the early 2010s in the late night. I was living with a relative along the eastern coast of North Carolina at the same time I was going to college. I had been playing Call of Duty Black Ops with a few friends online. I was starting to get a little tired but remembered I had been asked to go out and pick up some milk. I knew that the local Harris Teeter grocery stores were open 24/7, so leaving my house at 1 a.m. to grab milk was a non-issue. I grabbed my keys and wallet before throwing on my shoes and stepping out onto the front porch. To give some context, my relatives lived in a cul-de-sac. There was about 150 feet of pavement from the circle to the adjoining road. At the beginning of the circle, there was a street lamp that glowed a pale orange. Under this lamp lining one of the neighbors' properties were large palm trees. Specifically, these were sago palms that were roughly 5 feet high. Practically a massive bush. From the front porch, you can see this street light and palms without turning your head much to the right. With that being said, I stepped out onto the porch that fateful night and came to a halt. Something compelled me to stop. I was suddenly filled with a paralyzing fear I'd never experienced before and haven't since. I was quite literally frozen in place, not even 2 steps out the door. I only stood there for maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like ages. I looked over to the street lamp where the palm stood and didn't see anything at first. Suddenly, from behind the closest palm to the lamp sprung a tall creature. I only saw a quick glimpse of it, but it fled off into the darkness and out of view. I heard it give a cry that sounded like a raccoon chittering and a pig squealing at the same time. Just as quickly as this creature had appeared, it had disappeared without a trace. I have a friend who is a huge supernatural believer, and you can bet he was the first person I called after this event. One of his first questions was, what did it look like? And I told him this: the creature was just slightly taller than the palm it hid behind. It was a pale white humanoid, but it was missing a head. It was too thin and gangly to have been a human or ape of any kind, and it also seemed to be covered in light hair. There was, however, one single thing that I couldn't get my mind off of. Even today, it sends a chill down my spine and causes my hands to tremble. When I was standing on that porch, when I felt that fear take hold of me, there was one other feeling I had when I finally looked over. I was about to die. Whatever that creature was, its intent was hostile. I am truly convinced to this day that the thing wanted to harm me. Something saved me that night from walking blatantly into the dark. I don't know if it was instinct or some unknown force, but I will never forget my first and only encounter with the creature of North Carolina. Crawlers. Back in 2017, I lived with my aunt for several reasons, and while living with her, I got a job at Walgreens, which was roughly a 20 to 30 minute bike ride away, and the route took you through a very forested/woodsy area that also had a huge park in it, as well as some hiking/walking trails that would occasionally go underground for a bit. One night after working a closing shift, I was on my way home and got towards the area where the foresty/woodsy trail began/started, and I stopped a little ways into it and took my phone out to pop on some music, as well as to text my aunt that I was on the way home and to leave the door unlocked if she goes to bed. Shortly after sending the text and putting my phone back into my pocket, I heard the sound of a branch a short distance in front of me snap, which caused me to sharply look up, and that's when I saw it. A tall, bone-thin thing just standing in the middle of the trail a short distance in front of me. Large black eyes, no nose, and a small slit for a mouth. Its hands were slightly in front of it, as if it were in a semi-crouching/standing position, and I could see that its fingers were long and razor-sharp, bony-like. Its skin, or maybe a lack of skin, was a very palish yellow, almost like what an aged and dirty bone would look like. Before I could really, fully process this thing, it let out a screech, like It's hard to describe, but certainly wasn't a sound that humans or anything normal could produce, and it within a second had leapt from the trail into the bushes/woods, and almost as if a trance had been removed from me. I kicked off my bike and began to pedal as fast as I could so I could get away from the area and back home. The whole time I could hear twigs and heavy branches breaking in the distance, close enough to hear but far enough that the darkness and trees/shrubbery/bushes blurred my view of it. This thing was chasing me, or rather hunting me, and it terrified me. Ever since that encounter, I've been extremely wary and cautious of entering woods or heavily forested areas, especially at night, as I truly am deathly afraid of encountering a creature like that again. It was traumatizing to encounter something like that, but to also realize and feel that you are the subject of the hunt. Like a few months after this, I wound up moving out of state, and one of the main reasons was this event and creature, and last year, when I did finally move back to my home state with my fiancée, she had to keep calming me down because she knew I was anxious about coming home and possibly seeing that thing again. That event was also what made me truly believe in the paranormal and cryptids. I was a believer but highly skeptical before this event, but experiencing it and seeing for my own eyes made me lose all skepticism of these things and more. Werewolf encounter in PA and Silver didn't help. Hey folks, well, once again we're traveling down the proverbial rabbit hole. That's nothing new around here. I recently received a report that referenced a supernatural event that has me scratching my head. First I must ask, are there really humans who can transform themselves into werewolves or any other animal-like being? We are familiar with the Skinwalker scenario, where a Native American witch shapeshifts into an animal-like being and creates havoc with certain individuals living on a reservation. Could a similar transformation be possible through other supernatural means? I recently received the following information, which began with this message. I don't really know where else to go with my story. I warn you, if you are a purely rational person, you will have a hard time believing this. Anyway, here is my story. Before we start, let me state that I'm a bit befuddled by this account. I've read many hard-to-believe claims in the past, but for some reason this particular narrative strikes a nerve. I have consulted with a few other colleagues, including my friend Stan Gordon. The area in which this event occurred has been known for odd activity for many years. In fact, Stan mentioned an intense werewolf scare, though it was later found to be a hoax, that took place in the general area back when he was in high school. Anyway, here's what I received. So there is this guy, he's 20-something, and he lives in my hometown of West Newton, Pennsylvania. Now I am not friends or even acquaintances with him, but you can say we have mutual friends. They were talking about him being a werewolf, but they were somewhere between joking around and being serious. I don't know, but what I do know is that I was really into the paranormal and had a lot of free time on my hands. I never really believed in a lot of it though, until I met this kid. He just gave me a weird feeling. So I thought, I have nothing interesting to do, so let me investigate this. That's exactly what I did. To start the investigation, I followed him home from work on November 13, 2016. The reason I chose that certain date is because I didn't want to drag this on. That night was going to be full moon. I know, cliché. I got my friend, who wants nothing to do with this report, and we went across the street from this guy's house around 4 p.m. He left his house and headed up the road. Eventually he ended up going into the woods on the east side of town. We followed from a distance the whole time. We got to the woods and hid in a ditch. Around 5:30 p.m., he started doing the strangest thing. He started removing his clothes. To be honest, we were mouthing what the fuck the whole time. He then started to place his clothes into a plastic bag and pulled out a weird-looking belt. It was made of fur or hair, I don't know. Then around 6 p.m. it happened. The unbelievable happened. His body began to twist and contort in very unnatural ways. He then began to groan in pain. I get sick describing what happens next, so I'll leave that part up to your imagination. Then the worst possible scenario played out. He saw us. Actually, it wasn't him who saw us, it was the wolf. I made my friend run back towards town. I was having a panic attack. So, in self-defense, I pulled out a couple of my grandmother's silver spoons from her collection. I went back and got them a week or so later, and threw a couple at him and held the rest up in his direction. He still persevered and began running towards me. So I booked it out of there, but it only took a couple seconds for him to catch up. He lunged onto me and slashed at my arm with his claws. With my other hand, in which I was still holding the silver spoons, I pressed the silver as hard as I could onto his body. He whimpered and ran away. Long story short, I made it out of the woods. My friend had already called the police, and she lied when they asked if I had tried to harm myself. She said I had, which was probably for the best. I will never leave my house at night or around a full moon again. The email was sent as anonymous, and I have not received any further information. I sent a request for further evidence but received nothing. There was an attempt to contact the local police, but no one has returned the call. Is this a hoax? Maybe. But I'm going to keep an open mind until I hear otherwise. Like I stated earlier, odd activity is not a stranger in the West Newton, Pennsylvania, area. Stan stated to me today. That is the area where there has been a long history of Bigfoot encounters going back to the late 1960s. Back around 1966, the locals were seeing a 7-8 foot tall, white-haired Bigfoot creature that was known as the Lober monster. Lober is a community very close by. There have been numerous other encounters around there for years. Here are 2 previous reports from Stan Gordon. April 17, 2016, during the evening, a woman was driving on a rural road near West Newton when she noticed, ahead of her, a tall, dark figure emerge from the right side and move up on the road just as she was approaching the area. She slowed down and looked at a 7-foot-tall creature covered with long brownish-red hair. The witness noticed that the arms were very long and skinny and that the creature had large red eyes that were glowing in the dark. The witness, who had no interest or belief in Bigfoot, became very frightened and left the area very quickly. My girlfriend's strange encounter with a creature in Cape May, Dogman? This story is from my girlfriend's perspective, and she still to this day has no idea what she encountered. To begin, this story took place in 2018. I arrived in this small, rural town near Cape May. The company I was employed for at the time dispatched me to conduct door-to-door sales, promoting their cable and Wi-Fi products. The town itself was small and somewhat eerie, with people constantly staring at me or ignoring me. It seemed like a lot of the townspeople that I encountered that day were on edge, and it was a weird, tense atmosphere that I shrugged off, as people are weird all the time. I continued doing my job, chugging a Red Bull to keep me going, which didn't affect me at all, surprisingly. Apart from the peculiar atmosphere, the scenery turned out to be lovely once you left the main road. I had to stop at different streets, and some were in the woods on long and seemingly beautiful endless roads. It was quite scenic. I had a scheduled visit to a few houses on a small peninsula just before sunset. To get to this peninsula, you had to go down a very long road, past a summer camp area, past a trailer park, and past the woods, and then you finally find yourself in a small open area with a bay marsh, a couple small expensive houses, and shore access. The houses were so close to the water it seemed to be a code violation, but I'm sure they were built to withstand storms since they looked so expensive. Every house had its own theme, and the area was mostly deserted. Only one house had someone inside, whom I had talked to after knocking on his door. I was so distracted looking at the houses and scenery that I didn't notice how quickly sunset was approaching. I came to the realization that I should start heading back to avoid being alone on that long deserted pathway in the woods. As a smaller female, I'm never comfortable after dark in isolated places, especially without cell service. I was making my way down the path, so far so good, as it wasn't completely dark yet. As I approached the wooded area of the road, I was walking a bit faster since there were no street lights and the sunlight was rapidly disappearing. As I walked at a decently fast pace, I noticed something. The woods were eerily quiet. All the life that I was hearing before was gone. No crickets, no birds, just pure silence. I stopped in my tracks and got chills down my spine as I felt the feeling that I was being watched. I looked around the dark woods for any sudden movements, and then, like clockwork, something up ahead made its way out of the tree line. It looked to be some type of large animal. My brain went into overdrive, analyzing whatever this animal was. Was it a bear? A dog? No. It looked like a large dog. But dogs don't get this big. Though I was intimidated by its large size, whatever it was hadn't noticed me. Even though I was scared, I also didn't want to walk back and go into that one man's house. As a woman, I would rather take my chances with a wild animal than be alone with a man I don't know in a deserted holiday neighborhood. Suddenly, as I was thinking this, the large animal in the distance had finally noticed my presence. It was observing me, not entirely sure of what to do with me. There wasn't enough light anymore for me to see the animal's face, but I felt unusually frightened. Whatever I was looking at was definitely too big to be a black bear, with a shoulder height of at least 5 feet on all fours, which is comparable in size to a brown bear. The mass on this creature was extensive, as the outline of what I could see looked like a wolf on steroids. It was very muscular. I also noticed that the outline of its face was very similar to that of a German shepherd or a wolf, as it had perked ears and a long snout. In the heat of the moment, I could only hear the sound of my heart palpitating as fear and adrenaline started to crawl their way into my bloodstream. It felt as if time stood still, and then it dawned on me. What I was looking at wasn't a normal animal, and it was simply too big to be any animal that I could recognize from New Jersey's catalog of fauna. And if it wanted to attack me, I would be powerless against it. It was simply too big. Though, to calm myself down, I threw the idea that this creature was out of the ordinary out because I felt like this could be rationalized somehow. I made my brain go back to the idea of this being maybe a large dog or coyote. I also did not believe in cryptids and was completely unaware of what size coyotes are supposed to be, so I made a quick decision. Realizing that this could very well be a life or death situation, I came to the conclusion that this very large dog-like creature was probably a skittish coyote that I could scare off, at least temporarily, to calm down my nerves. What other choice did I have? The longer I kept standing there, the more aggressive I might come across to this animal, and I didn't want it to get territorial or get the idea that I was harmless prey. So, I decided I would make the most hideous, loud, confusing, and startling scream/howl I could muster and just sprint the rest of the way. After I screeched this hideous sound out of my body as hard as I could, the animal quickly changed its body language to defensive, but then it quickly changed its mind to deciding I wasn't worth a fight as it ran a decent distance into the woods, not too far though. I decided to sprint as fast as I could past that area and beyond. I sprinted until I reached the end of the road and noticed there was a summer camp area with street lights near me. I rested on top of a table there, out of breath and feeling my heart pound out of my chest. Despite everything, I remained shook up and sensed a constant presence. I kept my eyes on the tree line. My eyes were darting around, looking for any sign this animal was still there. Once I felt like the coast was clear, I located the next house I was scheduled to visit, and I quickly made my way over. I met a nice family who ended up buying cable from me, and I told them what had happened to me that night and how I was treated by the locals. The lady of the family, who I presume to be the mother, said, "I don't know why they sent you out here alone. These woods are dangerous after dark, and there are creepy people who live around here." The impression she was giving me was that there were animal encounters she couldn't explain and that there were lots of ex-convicts in the area, and people who should have been arrested but haven't been. She was equally concerned about the people as she was about the animals around this place. This gave me goosebumps. How many times today could my life have been taken? They were extremely concerned for my safety and told me to contact my team leader so I could get picked up. They said they didn't want me to go outside again and that I should call it quits for the night and not make it to any other houses. To this day, I still have no idea what creature I encountered. There are strange things in the woods, things people don't speak about or cover up. I felt like the townsfolk of that town knew something about what I encountered. So, weird creature I encountered in those woods, let's never meet again. Cryptid? Wolf creature/spirit sighting. Late the other night around midnight, I was driving home through the back roads as usual. I approached a slow speed turn and felt an urge to slow myself more than normal, and as the headlights rounded the turn, a large, dark figure broke the woodline and strode across the road on all four legs. As it crossed the lights, I caught a prolonged look at a large, wolf-like creature with a thick, coarse, black, patchy coat. It turned its head, and its large, yellow eyes resembled the moon, which had been vibrant and bright all weekend. The shoulders stood approximately 4 to 5 feet tall. Its body was as long as the lane I was in, not including head or tail. The encounter has left me physically and mentally shaken. I've never seen anything like it with my own eyes. I spend a lot of time outdoors and in the woods. Wolves aren't native to our area. The closest zoo is a few hours away. There are no local wolf dog breeders. Hours have been spent ruling out anything logical or rational, so here I am on. Please lend your knowledge. Many thanks in advance. Some sort of cryptid or some other type of night creature can't explain what I saw. I need some help. I live in Glen Innes in New South Wales, on the edge of town, near the farm fields and bush filled with brusque and gum trees. There was not a lot of light around, but last night it was nearly a full moon, so visibility was pretty good. I was walking around the field at about 11 p.m., about 40 meters from my house. I have two medium/large dogs that were inside the house, and they were barking, but I didn't really think anything of it as they normally bark randomly. I could hear some weird chirping sound coming from the bush about 20 to 30 meters away from my house and another one off in the distance near the road about 50 plus meters, but it didn't sound like any birds ever heard. When all of a sudden the insects in the immediate area stopped, it was deathly silent, very odd. As I walked back to the house, I noticed a sound of something running behind me on the grass/dirt. I didn't take much notice as we have rabbits and the occasional fox around. Stood by my house for about 10 minutes, then decided to go inside. Walking towards the front door from my carport, I noticed a small, long matted/scruffy black long-haired creature about 70 centimeters to 1 meter tall standing about 10 to 15 meters away from my door on the dirt patch in front of the house. I thought what that was, so I walked towards it, and it looked at me and took off very fast, faster than any animals I've ever seen. Within 2 to 3 seconds, it had run approximately 30 to 40 meters and ran straight into the shrub/bush that lines the porch. Mind you, it didn't hop, so it wasn't a roo or a wallaby, it ran and stayed the same height as it was when it was standing. I went inside, had a cigarette, then thought I'd go back out with a torch and have a look. I stood outside at the door and saw the thing standing on the edge of the grass field at the tree line watching me. Then I heard the similar chirping sound off in the distance again near the road and the same sound off to my left in the scrub/tree line on the left side of the house. Still no insect noises, mind you, very silent. I got a bit freaked out, as there must have been multiple of whatever these things were. I read up, and it sounds like they might have been a Junjudi. Can anyone verify it all? Are there things like this in rural Australia/New South Wales? Thank you for any help, much appreciated. West Kentucky humanoid encounter. About 10 years ago, my ex-husband and I were visiting friends, and the guys left to go rent some movies from a local video store. We live in a small town surrounded by other small neighboring towns. Lots of wooded areas and lots of country roads, not a lot of big city action. Street lights are on most roads but not the back roads type thing. My friend's husband, Zach, and my ex-husband, Josh, decided to hit a back road so Zach could show Josh a house he had been helping build. This road they were on I am familiar with because my grandparents live off it. It's a very long road, prob. 20 miles from start to finish. Also, a childhood friend of mine lived directly on this road, so I grew up in the SW woods and had myself heard some strange stories from down there. But it's not like people talked about this place being haunted or anything paranormal or anything. I just experienced weirdness myself as a kid. Mostly I chalked my stories up to being young and gullible or impressionable. Anyway, the guys were talking about the house and hanging out when the road somewhat curved. At that point off the side of the road stood a figure that my ex said had to be 7 feet tall. They were in a Dodge Neon, so he said maybe he could have mistaken its height because they were sitting low, but it towered over the vehicle. Neither of them said a word to each other until they had passed the figure. After they passed, another car was coming, and that car hit their brakes, which led the guys to believe that car 2 had seen it. Zach pulls into the next available place to turn around, and that's when they both started talking and freaking out. Did you see that? What was that? That kind of talk. They turned around, and where it had been now, nothing was there. Maybe 1 to 2 minutes after passing there was nothing there. They stopped the car and got flashlights out, no street lights, the only light had been their headlights. They hurried back to the house, and when they came inside, both were very quiet, and I was like, "What's up with you guys?" Each kept saying for the other to tell us. They tell us the story of what they had witnessed but with no description. So me and my friends separated the guys and asked them to draw what they saw. Basically it was the same thing, only one of them drew half of it, like the center over, and the other drew the entire figure. Both had the center as being black except red where the eyes are. Josh described that it didn't appear to have feet, and it was floating. Zach said he didn't remember if he looked at the feet because he was so taken back by the giant wings. The wings they both drew and said were white at the top, then faded to yellow, then red. The craziest part to me was that both guys said that it wasn't flapping the wings up and down like you would think someone would say, but that it was flapping them in towards the center body and then back out. My ex and I would talk about this in great lengths for years, and I always asked him if a story I heard was similar to what he had seen, and he would say yes, kind of, or no. Zach has since been in an accident and suffered a traumatic brain injury. In the accident that he was in, he was alone on his motorcycle, and the eyewitness said he seemed to have just driven off the side of the road like something ran in front of him. But he is no longer able to communicate to be able to tell anyone what happened to him that night. But it always made me wonder if he saw the creature again or if it was some sort of omen warning for what was to come. I'd love to hear if anyone has heard of anything similar to this and what your story is. Thanks. So when I was younger, I went to a summer camp on Wabamun Lake in Alberta, Canada. Which is in the middle of the goddamn woods, good spot. Anyway, when I got older, there were a few small cabins for the older kids. Up 127 steps. I know that because they made us count. Anyway, at the top to the right there are trails to other sites, and to the left are the cabins. 3 youth cabins on one side of the clearing, and on the other is one staff cabin. All of the cabins are on stilts that are approximately 3 to 3.5 in height, with one door in the middle of the front and 2 windows on the front, one on either side of the door. One on either side in the middle of the building. Which were between 2 bunks, and one on the back. Which was at the foot end of the rear bunk. There are 3 bunks laid widthwise on the left when you go in the door, and 2 laid lengthwise on the right with approximately 2 feet between them all. The side and back windows were in between the bottom and top bunk height but closer to the top bunks. However, the top of those windows was still 9 to 10 off the ground with the stilts on the bottom of the cabins. Also, there were shitty curtains that didn't cover the full window. There were about 4 to 8 on either side of them that didn't cover the window. I was on the first top bunk on the left side with a full view of all the windows. We set up and leave for day 1. When we come back to pack up for the night, we all hop in bed and duck around like 13 to 14-year-olds do. Then, after all of that, before we decide to sleep, I have my flashlight pointed to the left of my cabin mate's head, which was closest to the right side window feet to the front of the cabin, and we talk for a bit when I notice at the top of the window between the gap where the curtain doesn't cover the window there is just something white reflecting light back at me, and in my head, I don't really pick up that it's weird, so I turn my eyes to it, and before I can focus on what it was, it darts out of the window and away from the cabin. And I just feel this primal sense of dread overwhelm me, and I go apeshit like a scared 13-year-old does. However, before I can calm down, my other cabin mate sees something in the top left corner of the back window and starts losing his SHT as well. Once we calm down and people are asking us what we saw, we both describe the same thing, something white that moved out of the way as we saw it and scared us beyond belief for no reason. What ducks with me to this day, however, is that it was at the top of the window, therefore, whatever it was must have had to be at least 9 to 10 tall. We did not see it again that night. On the second night, some of the other boys who thought we were just ducking with them convinced us to go outside that night with them to look around and see if we could find it. Which completely terrified myself and the other guy that had seen it. We're all looking with our flashlights about 60 feet down a trail near the cabin when behind a tree maybe 150 feet away from myself and 3 of my cabin mates see an extremely pale, lanky figure with what looked like antlers stride to the left diagonally away from us extremely fast and absolutely silently. It had no visible hair either. All 4 of us ran as fast as our little legs could carry us back to the cabin, and once everyone was in, we locked the door and jumped in bed while losing our shit. A couple of us were crying from it. A counselor came to check on us to ask us why we were being so damn loud, and when we explained, they just thought we were ducking with him, so he told us to go to sleep and stop being so loud. I didn't see it again that night, but a couple others did. Same reaction pretty much as everyone else had. And nothing for the next day. On the 4th night, though, we heard screaming in the woods about a half hour after myself, and the guy in the bunk beside me on the left saw it in the right side window at the same time. Nobody moved or went to check. Thomas Weber, we heard our counselor leave his cabin and look around for us with his flashlight for 2 minutes. By fire, he came to our cabin and looked inside. When he noticed that we were all inside and awake, the speed of the way his face went from anger to terror was almost instant. He just said, "Lock the door," before sprinting to his cabin and doing the same. The next morning we noticed scratches on the door of our cabin and his. Which is strange because I didn't sleep for longer than maybe 2 hours that night. If that. Okay, so does that sound like anything to you guys? I've tried so hard to find an explanation for what this could have been, like a fleshgate or a skinwalker, Wendigo. I'm in Alberta, so I don't think it could have been a Fresno nightcrawler. Also because when I saw it, it had arms, and Fresno nightcrawlers don't have arms. Werewolf? Lichen? Dogman? So this happened a few months ago, during the summer of quarantine. I was running through a wooded trail in my area, very good woods there, was just jogging, and hoped to see some wildlife, maybe a deer or other similar animal. We have deer all around our area, so not too far-fetched. I understand this might seem odd and weird, but it's true. I was alone at the time. I was wearing a black t-shirt, gray joggers, and running shoes, plus a light neon orange vest to dissuade any hunters in the area. Less of a serious thing, more of a precaution. I was jogging, and I had earbuds and listening to some tunes. Less intelligent on my part, yes. I passed by a pond, and I slowed down because laying right there are 2 bodies. One looked like a coyote of sorts, and another was a deer. There were a lot of flies around there. The coyote was untouched except for the killing blow to the stomach, but the deer was ransacked, and I went closer to the bodies out of sheer curiosity, and neither had rigor mortis, which seemed extremely odd considering it was afternoon, around 4 p.m., and sunset that day was like 7:30ish. For those who don't know, rigor mortis is when the body stiffens up and the joints can't be moved. This happens to all animals. Rigor mortis takes anywhere from 2 to 12 hours to set in from my memory. 2 to 6 for lower extremities, 6 to 12 for the entire body, like the chest/neck/torso. These things were floppy. That immediately got my guards up, as that means they died within the last 2 hours by something large and dangerous, given the fact that the coyote's stomach was slashed open and visible. I sort of just brush it off, but take out an earbud so I can keep an ear open while still enjoying my music. I keep running, and I start thinking I hear panting and footsteps behind me, but then my rational brain realizes, oh, that's what I'm doing. Breathing hard and running. Through a forest. With freshly killed, dead animals near me. So I started picking up my pace. What happened next stuck with me. A branch broke behind me, something that I simply ran by and didn't step on. It snapped, like something stepped on it, so I stopped panting and held my breath. I still heard panting, so my mind went OSHT, but it was fairly faint. I thought, well, whatever is behind me will outrun me, so I come to a stop, heart pounding, pulse racing. I turn around slowly, and there's nothing behind me, but I do see a dark-haired, clawed foot coming from behind a tree. This wasn't a bear's foot, it was splayed out, with claws on each toe. There were 5 toes, I remember. It was also larger than my foot. I'm an American size 11 men's. I whip around and start sprinting. I hear whatever it is start running too. I get to the end of the path, near a main road with cars going up and down. I get to the edge and turn around. There it is, some sort of dog-like / wolf-like man. It had no tail and was on all fours with very dark brown, maybe black hair. The ears were straight up, like a Doberman. The eyes were yellow. The animal was very muscled in general, not like super toned but like naturally toned. I could see the muscles on it. It reared up on its hind legs. This creature was way over my head. I'm 5.10. It was probably 7.5 feet tall, I think. I'm almost certain this was a werewolf or lichen / dogman. I'm from the northeast area. Something's down there. Back when I was young, I used to live near a huge river situated under a gorge. Well, not exactly near. It was technically a street and a field away, but that didn't stop me and my cousins from going there to explore, much to the dismay of our overprotective parents. Especially when I tell you why. This story is not so much about me but about my uncle, who lived particularly close to the river. He was an outdoorsman, but the rugged one with nature type. You can tell from his tanned, muscular body that this guy has done his fair share of manual labor, and he has the power and skills to prove it. Anyway, his particular hobby was fishing, and not in the traditional boat and reel kind. He and some of his buddies did so by taking the inner tube of what looked like a truck tire and using it as a flotation device, lying on top of it while they paddled and dragged a net around. For some reason, this works because, as he said, fish aren't as spooked by what would appear as flotsam to them. Incidentally, this is how he primarily provided for his family. So anyway, the river itself, it was pretty wide, with foot-deep shallow parts that most people can walk straight through to the other side. The current on these parts wasn't particularly strong, and the sediment was pretty solid, so you had no real danger of slipping or getting stuck. But some parts? They were deep as 25 feet and pretty murky, and these were where the current was strangely strong. These parts are incidentally the same spots my uncle and his buddies fished. Now, it won't come as any surprise that some people have drowned in this river. Hell, that's what our parents back then were so afraid of, because we were just small kids near a really dangerous expanse of water. And of course, the stories. One in particular came from my uncle himself, about a kid who swam around the deep parts and suddenly got dragged down. Not swept away by the current, not cramps, but dragged down. He'd play up this story by telling it was a shokoi, a malevolent merman who prowls deep water for people to drown. Of course, only the most impressionable of us kids believed him. Until he himself had his own personal story to tell. He told us that one day he was fishing with 2 of his buddies, and like always, they were at the deep part of the river. That day the current was pretty strong, but their inner tubes were anchored on the riverbank so they weren't particularly getting dragged far from their spot, only he was slightly distanced from his buddies on account of his rope anchor being too long. He said after a while, he felt his inner tube jolt harder than what the current was initially capable of. He tried steadying himself best he could, but the more he fidgeted around to balance himself, the more it got harder to do so. Then he suddenly slid off. No, what he told us was that he felt his inner tube was pulled off right under him. Instantly, he was underwater, and while this was nothing new, he was a great swimmer, he felt like he was being weighed down by something. He couldn't see very well from the murky river water, but he swears he saw some dark shadow around his legs, preventing him from kicking up and treading water. The fact that he had little time to draw a breath before he went under was not making it easy. Fortunately, one of his friends saw him go under, and when he noticed my uncle thrash about a little, which they said he never does because that spooks the fish, he quickly went closer and yanked my uncle up to surface level. After that, my uncle was able to kick free from whatever was holding him down, and they all went back to the riverbank to rest. When asked what happened, All my uncle told his friends was that something was dragging him down, and he had no idea what the hell it was. They decided that was enough fishing for one day and retreated back to much more solid ground. Needless to say, that story was more than enough to scare the more sensible of us kids into not going to the river, especially when the current was too strong. If someone like my uncle, who practically grew up in water, nearly died, what chance did we have? Of course, that wasn't the end of that, because over the years, we still heard about people drowning in that river under mysterious circumstances. My uncle still fishes there today, but at his age, he's more than glad to stay on dry land and just use a fishing rod, but he never casts anywhere near the spot he almost got dragged under to his death. "Something's down there, and I'm not going to tempt it to try again," he said. A Bigfoot chased me and my friends out of my own home. My name is Matthew, and I am 16 years old and a firm believer in all things supernatural and unworldly. My family has lived in the same house since I was born, 2004. And it's currently only me and my mother and our cats. Our house is on a street with trees outside the back of the house, which leads to a hill and then to a nature trail. Which is not a long walk to my house, and our yard is surrounded by fences with sharp posts sticking out the top of them and a main road out the front of the house with 2 neighbors on each side of it. My mother is a rational person. She tries to make sense of everything that happens that she can't explain, but this one time she threw all of that out the window. It was around February 2017, and me, my mother, and a few friends of ours were all sitting around a small fire we built. We were all having a good time, the adults were drinking and talking, and me and my friends were cooking sausages over the fire. One of my friends got up and went to the bathroom out the back of the house, and while he was gone, he yelled to everyone, "Hey guys, are there any animals around here?" My mother replied, "Yes, but just our cats and maybe some kangaroos." "Why?" My friend replied, "I see 2 red, glowing eyes staring at me from a tree." The tree was taller than our house, and you would need a small crane, those things that people use to fix power lines, to reach at least halfway to the top. My mother goes outside to check it out, and the instant she saw whatever was on the tree, she quickly made everyone go inside. We were all questioning why she was making us go in because we were having a good time, and all she replied with was, "Stay quiet and don't look out any windows." We all listened and waited around for about 15 minutes before we heard a very loud scream. It made everyone's ears ring and sounded aggressive. At this point, everyone was freaking out, not knowing what was outside. Another minute passed before we heard a loud thud on the roof. Now there is no way to get onto the roof without either climbing it like a champ or using a ladder. This sounded like someone had jumped from a tree onto the roof. We all watched in silence as it made its way along the roof into a window that wasn't fully covered. I went over and quickly shut the blind to the window, but as I did, a large, hairy hand slammed onto the glass and cracked it, making me fall backwards and scream. It lowered down and hung onto the roof of the house and screamed back at me. Its face showed signs of anger and hatred. It wanted to kill me and everyone in the house, who were also screaming and scrambling to get weapons. It started to bang on the glass while screaming and wailing. We all quickly backed up to the wall and just waited for it to break in and tear us apart, but it stopped. We heard nothing for about an hour. We all started to calm down, but something I can't bear to remember again that still shakes me to my core was the sound of glass in my mother's room breaking and hearing the sound of it crawling its way into the house. My mom's friend quickly ran and grabbed our car keys off the table before screaming. The creature was in the hallway bleeding from its legs and hands because of the glass. It screamed so loudly that I and a friend went deaf for a few minutes because of it. My mother ran up to it and started yelling in Hungary at it and hit it with a mallet along the face. She kept screaming at it before it broke her hand after grabbing it and crushing it. All the adults charged into it, causing it to stumble over and give us time to run outside and into the cars. We all quickly backed up as the creature ran out of the house and jumped the fence onto the hood of the car. My mom's friend backed up fast and quickly stopped to make it go over the back of the car and onto the ground. After he did that, he drove away, the others following close behind us in their cars. We heard screams as we drove away into a hospital and then to another friend's house. When we returned home a few hours later, police were there taping up our house and a neighbor's house. That neighbor had her arm torn off, and her roommate's chest ripped open. The door was ripped off its hinges, and from what I saw on the inside, it was just chaos. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like a battle happened inside. We did not return to our house for around 5 months. When we did return, the window was still broken and we had a small family of birds living on top of my mom's bed. We are still living here in the house. We haven't heard or seen anything since that night, a night I will never forget for as long as I live. Possible encounter from a Michigan nature park worker. For my safety, I do not want to reveal which park system I work for, but it is important to the story that I, F19, work a position at a Michigan nature park not entirely dissimilar to that of a park ranger. My job duties usually include manning the entry booth and locking up the buildings at night. And although not a usual duty, sometimes they ask me to walk or take a parked vehicle through some of the trails. As I am on the younger side but still have several years of experience at the park, I'm a relatively experienced outdoorsman. I've had some odd things happen to me while on the job that I can't quite explain. I'm decently well versed in some areas of the paranormal, and although not entirely relevant, it's worth noting that I'm also a Norse pagan as part of a family belief and often wear protective symbols as well. And to be honest, I've started wearing them more since these odd things have been happening. I've tried looking into it myself, but overall I'm overwhelmed and not sure where to look, so a friend suggested I ask a forum like this about my experiences. I have 2 specific questions I would like to ask. Thing 1. I usually work the night shift, and this night in particular it was raining a lot and the conditions were getting unsafe. I was posted out in the booth, which is multiple miles from the office, so when things took a turn for the worse, my boss radioed me back. Some people who don't spend a lot of time in the woods don't realize how dark deep woods can get, much less in the dark at night. But I had both a flashlight and the light from the booth, which gave me probably 30 feet of visibility. And when I went to grab my stuff so I could lock up the booth and get to my car, I swear I saw something that moved very human-like but moved in a really odd way. Like the only way I can describe it is if a horse-deer hybrid tried to run like a person. But there were no people out there, and it was most definitely not a deer. I'm probably not describing it in the best way, but it was very off. So I got to my car ASAP, and it didn't start right away, a bit odd but not entirely out of character for my car, but when I turned the key a second time, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, and it looked like whatever it was had gotten closer. The drive goes without incident, but I'm still off about what I saw, and when I get closer, I radio in to see if they need me to pick anyone up. And the radio doesn't work right, which was very out of character. These radios are designed to work in awful conditions, and I was the closest I'd been to any sort of signal in a while. I chalked it up to the weather and pulled into the office. But as I do, something runs past me. I did not get a good look at what it was, but it was not a person, and I'm telling you there's not an animal in that woods that I know of that looks like either of the things I saw. I can't seem to shake the sensation. Thing 2. This happened more recently and is what prompted me to finally reach out to a forum of some kind. I was walking the trails for security purposes close to closing. We close around 11 p.m. and start a final walkthrough around 9 p.m. We do this to make sure no one's stuck on the trail or hurt, so they aren't stuck overnight when there's fewer staff and none that patrol those trails. So I was walking one of our trails, and I was pretty deep in the woods already, as I'm a fairly fast hiker, and this is a trail I know well. I was already about 2 miles into the trail when things started to get weird. I hear a noise off in the distance, and at first I thought it could be a coyote or an owl, so I pressed on. Coyotes stay off the trails, won't go after people unless they have dogs, and dogs are banned in the woods here, and they know when we do our sweeps, so I was not concerned. But then the noises got weirder. I'm used to the sounds of the woods, and I know the area and the wildlife very well, and I have never once in my life heard that sound before. It didn't come from any animal I recognize, and it most definitely was not human. I've never aborted a sweep before, even when I've had coyotes nearby, but it did not feel right, and I got out of there. We are allowed to use our judgment in these cases. If anyone has any idea what either of these things could be, please let me know. I really appreciate it. An encounter with a Wendigo. A man named Brian Sullivan who claims that he had an encounter with a Wendigo creature in February 1972. He mentions that it was January at the end of the interview, but I emailed him, and he personally confirmed that it was February and that when he was telling the story, he got worked up and got confused. On the far side, we found a nice steep hill. We can go sledding. That's what we can do, so we climbed up to the top, and we found that the top of that hill was another steep hill, so we climbed up to the top of that one, and on the top of that one, sitting at another angle to it, was a third steep hill. So we were in hog heaven. We were like, man, we're going to make the ultimate luge run ever. And it was about in the 20s today, the snow's kind of melty, we can make this really great sledding run, it's going to be awesome. So we spent all afternoon making this awesome sledding run with supers and embankments and everything on it. So we said, it's too wet to use it now. We gotta come back after it freezes again. So, 2 days later, it was 20 below, and it was afternoon, second week in February, 1972. And we said, well, let's go back and go sledding now. It's super cold, it's Friday, school's over, awesome, we'll get in some sledding all day. And we took off with our little sleds and went back there. Well, Each of us made 2 runs down the hill, and we had started out in such a way that I can't remember which one of us got to the top first, but one of us was going down the hill while the other one was only about halfway up the second hill. So, when one was at the top, the other was at the bottom, working our way up. And it was going back and forth. When it was my turn, I was up at the top, and I put my little sled down. I had a 5 or 6 foot rut right up to the edge of this really steep first hill. And I looked back behind me, and all that was on this hill was just barren hardwood trees, mostly smaller ones. A few popples, and there was one really huge black spruce that was about 40 feet away from me. I turned around. I was about to jump on my scooter, but something just didn't seem right, so I turned back and looked again. I'm 10 years old. I'm not that observant. I'm like, something just looks different, and again, something in the back of my head went, that's just not right. That's not right. So I turned around and I looked, and I went, by golly, it's not right. That black spruce only has 1 trunk, not 3. And those 2 extra trunks have fur on them, well, hair, really long hair. Long gray hair. What's that long gray hair? Is there some kind of snow pant with long hair or something? Ah, it must be somebody pranking me. So I looked up above to where, a teenager or even an adult would be, like maybe 5 or 6 feet, but there were just pine branches there. Then I noticed rustling up above that about 3 more feet, so I looked up above that and up at 9 feet, and there was this face looking at me, and it had its hands like this, mimics holding tree branches apart with his left hand, lower branch, and his right hand, upper branch, while peering through, holding one branch apart at the top and the bottom, peering down at me, and it went, mimics a wide open mouth grin, and it grinned. And its face did not look even remotely human. It had a flat nose with 2 little slits, it had a big, thick brow ridge, receding forehead. It was hard to see from up here. I don't know if it had a crest or not because that's where the branch was. When it grinned, I could see all of its teeth. It had upper and lower canines, and all of its teeth in its mouth and the front that I could see were all sharp, so it was obvious to me this thing was a predator. I found out after the fact that actually the only time a great ape would bare its teeth at something is when it's trying to scare it, so basically it was saying, this is one of the weapons I will use to tear you apart. So at the time, not knowing that but being plenty scared anyway, I leapt on my sled, and I flew down that hill as fast as I could. I'm surprised I didn't melt the snow or start the hillside on fire, and I didn't care if I went off one of the supers and killed myself or hit a tree, that was irrelevant, I was just going to get away from the monster. And about halfway down the hill, as I was flying down it, my friend was walking up and saw me coming, and he said, I didn't even have to guess what was going on, I just saw your face was white, your eyes were bulging, and you said, run like hell. So I jumped on my sled, and I was right behind you. Now when I got to the end of the fire lane, back at the house, it was about 3 miles away. I was about 15 minutes if that. For about 10 of those minutes, I was standing there going, where was I just at? I'm not waiting for Dave. Why am I waiting for Dave? I suffered from hysterical amnesia and was unable to recall the entire incident for 2 years. And finally, at one point, my friend Dave, we had this little gathering with me, him, and 3 or 4 other friends, and he said, remember that time we went sledding out there at the end of the fire lane? I'm like, no. He said, yeah, we went across that bog, and we found those really steep hills, the 3 of them stacked up? And I'm like, no. And he goes, yeah, and you were coming down the hill really fast, and you said run like hell. Boom. And it all came back. You asshole, why did you remind me of that? And for like a month, I wouldn't talk to him because it was so traumatic. Actually, I'm still getting treated for post-traumatic stress to this day, and that's one of the things I'm being treated for. When you're 10 years old and you see a 9-foot predatory monster, which turns out to be the Wendigo, after a few decades of studying, it's not a comforting thing. And it also ruins your belief in authority figures and your parents, who told you there's no such thing as monsters. And look, there's a friggin' monster right there, don't tell me there's no such thing as monsters. And I see bears all the time. I live a mile from the county dump. There's 3 or 4 of them in my yard every week during the summer, so it isn't like I'm mistaking it. And this is in the middle of winter, second week in January, 20 below, so bears aren't going to be up wandering around anyway. Plus, they are not 9 feet tall. With 8 to 10 inches of grayish-white hair, especially in Minnesota. Although it did have claws on its hand, which is another thing that threw me. It took me years to figure that one out because all the Bigfoots they show, including Patty, didn't have claws or anything like that. It took me a long time to research, but the eastern Bigfoot, the Wendigo type, actually does have claws. And a gorilla has sharp teeth. So that's it. Bigfoot sightings in the 19th century, 1870s, 1890s. Bigfoot in the 1870s. A wild man 7 feet tall, possessed of great muscular power, and large, fiery red eyes was seen for several weeks around May 1871 between Sabi and Cranesville, on what is called Piney, in McNairy County, Tennessee. His entire body was covered in hair, with tangled and matted jet black hair hanging from his head to his waist and a beard that reached below his midsection. He shuns the sight of men but approaches with wild and horrid screams of delight every woman who is unaccompanied by a man, the news report read. He sometimes, with great precaution, approaches houses, and should he see a man, runs away with astonishing swiftness, leaping the tallest fence with the ease of a deer, defying alike the pursuit of men and dogs. He has frightened several women by attempting to carry them off, as well as by his horrid aspect, and the whole country around Sabi is in consternation. The citizens are now scouring the woods and are determined either to capture or drive off the monster. Another creature with the appearance of an immense orang-outang was seen in Gatesville, Texas, in the summer of 1871. It was about 7 feet tall, covered head to toe with a thick coating of hair, eyes that shone like fire, and a double row of murderous-looking teeth. When last seen, it was holding a large, crooked stick in one hand and a young calf it had just killed under its other arm. A posse was organized to capture or kill the monster. A wild man with long whitish hair of bristly stiffness was chased and took cover in a cave near Ocala, Florida, in May 1873. Pursuers weren't sure if their quarry, described as possessing gigantic proportions and being between 5 and 7 feet in height, was man or beast. That same month in North Georgia's Fannin County, an 8-foot wild man was accosted by several citizens who attempted to capture him. The beast killed one of the townsfolk and tore the tail off a horse. In mid-July 1873, a cattle driver encountered a wild man on Blue Mountain in the Appalachians, within Upper Burn Township in eastern Pennsylvania. The creature was entirely covered in hair, about 3 inches in length. After returning home with his cattle, the man led some neighbors back up the ridge to catch the critter, but he had disappeared. Some think that the whole thing is a hoax, while others think otherwise, stated the news report in a timeless sentiment about Bigfoot. The Berks County wild man, who haunted Blue Mountain looming over the neighborhood of Swatara Gap, Pennsylvania, was seen again in September 1874. This is potentially a reference to the same creature encountered the previous year in Upper Burn Township, about 23 miles east. The creature of Swatara Gap was said to be over 7 feet high with a face and body covered with hair. He walked on his hands and feet and jumped 10 feet at a time with apparent ease. Several prospectors at work in the heart of Globe Valley, North Carolina, miles from civilization, spotted a strange giant at 40 yards distant around New Year's 1878. They crept forward to within 20 steps away and saw that the wild man was 6'5", with broad shoulders and long, ape-like arms. His face was smooth and his head funnel-shaped. His body was covered with dark brown hair, nearly 2 inches in length, and long, luxuriant, dark red tresses covered his head and most of his forehead. One of the prospectors yelled and jumped toward the wild man, who started toward the group and pounded his chest. He then fled, and the party returned to one of the men's houses to secure firearms and continue the pursuit. While the group failed to find the monster, they ascended the crags of Blowing Rock and discovered a small cave containing a bed of leaves and the bones of many small animals, presumably the wild man's home. 2 young men from Pownell, Vermont, brought home exciting news of a frightening monster they had encountered while hunting in the mountains south of Williamstown, Vermont, in October 1879. They described it as being about 5 feet tall, resembling a man in form and movement, but covered with bright red hair, sporting a long, straggly beard, and staring with wild eyes. It sprang from behind a rocky cliff and ran for the nearby woods. Mistaking the wild man for a bear or other wild animal, one of the young men fired his gun and likely wounded it, eliciting cries of pain and rage. The beast turned on his assailants and ran them off at high speed, the hunters losing their guns and ammunition in the flight, deciding never to return. The encounter revived memories among locals of a tale from many years prior about a strange animal resembling a man that was frequently witnessed along the Green Mountains that extend throughout Vermont. Early settlers would periodically search for the creature, but it was so wild that no one could get close enough to tell what it was or where it dwelt. Bigfoot in the 1880s. On the farm of W.D. Green, on the road leading from the village of Florida to Glenmere Lake in Orange County, New York, not far from Newton, New Jersey, a curious, nondescript animal was said to inhabit a cave in 1881. 2 men named Armstrong and Sullivan were working in a field near the cave when the creature emerged. It so much resembled a human that Armstrong, who was eating his lunch, offered it a piece of bread. The animal gritted its teeth and ran back to the cave, which was said to have a small entrance but a large interior. Later, a hunter named Ira Seabolt chanced to pass the cave and saw the creature lying upon a stone wall. He shot at it, and the animal reacted with a cry of mingled rage and pain before fleeing back into its lair. Green collected a quantity of the creature's shaggy hair, about 8 inches long, that Seabolt's bullet had removed. Witnesses said that the wild man walked half upright and prowled considerably at night, making unearthly noises. People will not travel the road near where the cave is located, and Mr. Green could not sell his otherwise valuable farm for a cent an acre at the present time on account of the superstition prevailing among the country people, the news reported. On October 1, 1886, the Lewiston Evening Journal in Maine reprinted a story from the Waterville Sentinel, stating it would regard the tale as Munchausenist if not for the source. According to the Sentinel, 3 men were camping in the woods about 100 miles north of Moosehead Lake in northern Maine. 2 of the men returned after being away for a week and found their companion slain. They soon procured a dozen strong and set out in search of the unknown murderer. It proved to be a terrible wild man, 10 feet tall, with arms 7 feet in length, covered with long, brown hair, reported the Sentinel. The party fired several shots into the wild man and finally struck a vital spot, laying the monster low. There was no mention of what became of the body. For several weeks in early fall 1888, the citizens of Big Run and vicinity in Henderson Township, Pennsylvania, near Punxsutawney, had been marveling at strange footprints found in the forest paths. Though resembling a human footprint to some degree, the toes were too long and the foot too wide in front and narrow in the back. Clayville resident George Depp, son of Bush Depp, was walking along the road in the woods, near the old Kramer oil well, when he saw a few rods ahead of him, about 50 feet, clearly in broad daylight, a hideous monster. It appeared to be a man with long, shaggy hair all over his body, long and enormous arms, and a huge mouth filled with big, white teeth. "I thought sure I had met the devil himself," said Depp. Another wild man had been seen about 2 months earlier in the forest close to the nearby borough of Mahaffey. In spite of this history and Depp's account, it emerged in November that the 18-inch tracks found near Big Run were a hoax after the pair of artificial feet used to make them were discovered. Bigfoot in the early 1890s. As reported on April 5, 1891, Alexander Shepard and a friend from Vernon, Indiana, were strolling through the hills in that vicinity when they discovered a cave opening. Guided by lantern, they explored the interior until they found themselves face to face with a gorilla or wild man, covered with a rough coat of brown hair. The strange creature stared at the men for a second and then ambled off. Shepard and his friend were too alarmed to follow, but while retracing their steps to the exit, they found a storeroom partly filled with potatoes, corn, wheat, the bones of fowls, etc. Local farmers frequently complained about the theft of their wares. A party began forming to explore the cave. A year earlier, a man named Baines had also claimed to have discovered a hairy wild man in a cave near Vernon but was so ridiculed over his declaration that he had never revealed the cave's location. A strange creature resembling a gorilla was seen in the hills adjacent to the Capay Valley northwest of Sacramento, California, on April 10, 1891. It was said to be at least 6 feet tall when standing erect, traveled on all fours, climbed trees, had wonderful strength in its hands, and sported a shaggy covering. Farmers near Ouija in Belmont County, Ohio, gathered on August 27, 1891, to hunt down the wild man or animal that had been killing and devouring their sheep, hogs, chickens, and more. Many of the farmers and their families were afraid to work in their fields, go out after their stock, or even sleep at night, fearing the wild man would get them. One witness, Samuel Crow, said the creature was covered with dark reddish hair, had large ears, small eyes, a huge mouth, teeth like a wild boar, and enormous paws. It stood about 5 feet and appeared to weigh 200 pounds. The wild man walked and ran as well on 2 or 4 legs, could climb a tree or hill quickly, and was only seen in the mornings and evenings. Dr. W. H. Dimmitt of Vanceburg, Kentucky, said on August 2, 1892, that local citizens were much excited over the existence of a genuine wild man haunting the hills and thickets of Lewis County. Dimmitt, who saw the animal himself, described it as being of gigantic stature, covered with a thick growth of hair, and being fierce and untamable. One man encountered the creature in a lonely part of the hills and attempted to start a conversation with him. A shower of rocks welcomed his first words, and the man made a hasty retreat. Another Kentucky man-beast was reported in June 1894 to be living in a cave in Washington County. He was described as having long, white hair hanging down from his head and face as coarse as a horse's mane, with legs covered with hair, feet like those of a bear, with long claws, hands more like a feline than a human being, and with a light from his eyes and mouth similar to fire. He stole chickens and eggs from local farms, terrorizing the neighborhood. A tale of a creature that turns into an owl. I'm Latina, so in our culture we are gifted jewelry at a young age. When I was little, My mom purchased a necklace that has the Virgin Mary on it with diamonds surrounding it. I was around the age of 14 years old, I believe. I decided to go outside to jump on the trampoline we had. Yes, it was pretty late. I can't really say what time it was, but it was pretty dark out, but my mom had porch lights that face out to light up the front yard. So I'm jumping and enjoying the alone time when all of a sudden a bird came down and snatched my necklace off of me. I freaked out because the bird with its wings spread out was taller than me at the time. It felt like it could literally come down and snatch me if it wanted to. So I ran in and told my mom that a bird snatched my necklace. I was so upset and confused because my mom didn't believe me, and she thought I lost it when playing outside. The very next morning, my mom is in the kitchen making coffee and pancakes for us before going to school. My mom has a little window above her sink where she can look out to the backyard, and right next to that window is an old tree. We lived in this house for 20 years now, and the tree was there before we moved into it. Anyway, my mom looks out, and hanging from the window was my necklace. My mom was so confused because if I lost it in the front, why was it in the back hanging by the window? My dad gets a ladder to get it. My mom sat me down and told me a tale. That witch can turn into owls. My mom believes a witch was watching me and that we need to tell the witch/owl to stay away from me. She said they can be bad, but there are some people who believe they can be good. My mom put the necklace back on me. That night my mom heard an owl, and she thinks it was resting on that tree. But it was screeching and clicking. Honestly, I don't know if owls make those kinds of noises, but my mom was not having it and went to the back porch and yelled, "We don't want you here. We don't need your company. You are to leave this property and leave this family alone." This was the polite way to put it because originally she was speaking Spanish and cussing it out. I never had another experience with an owl after that until maybe 5 years ago. I used to work a midday shift from 12:30 to 9 p.m. and I would have to get my daughter from my mom after work to go home. Well, that's what I did, and I was driving, and it was dark, and leaving my mom's home, something landed on top of my car, but I thought it was maybe like trash or a branch fell. Kept going, came to a stop, and an owl flew over to an extinguisher that was on the side of the road and just stared at me. I took my phone out to take a picture, but when I did it flew away, so I was like, okay, it's just an owl, and it's not what my mom told me years ago. So I didn't see it anymore. I continued, and then the owl flew along me past me onto a stop sign, and then I just started to freak out and I started yelling at it. Telling it to leave us alone, and we don't want anything to do with you. I just did what my mom did when it happened before. I never saw it again, and I never experienced it again. When my daughter was born 8 years ago, I gifted her that same necklace my mom gifted me, and she still wears it to this day. I'm not sure if anyone can tell me if it's true about the tale my mom told me when I was younger. Maybe it was just an actual owl praying for food, and I saw it right? Ike. Frightening encounter, chased by a squatch. The person who shared their encounter with me, who I will refer to as Jane, is now 38 years old, but at the time of the encounter she was 16 years old. I found Jane to be an intelligent and articulate person who I believe truly encountered what she described to me. Including Jane, there were 5 people in total that had the encounter. I did not speak with any other of the people involved in the encounter. These other 4 people involved in the encounter were approximately the same age as Jane. The location of the encounter. As mentioned above, I will not reveal the exact location of the sighting. However, I can say that the encounter took place on a First Nation reserve in southern Manitoba. The area on the reserve where the encounter took place was away from the more populated area where the main community resides. While there are some trees in this area, it was by no means a wilderness area, as the location of the reserve is generally within the Great Plains area. The details of the encounter. I believe that the encounter took place either in the fall or early winter. One night Jane and 4 of her friends were driving in a car around an unpopulated section of the reserve looking for something to do. 3 people, including Jane, were in the back seat, and 2 people were in the front seat. The moon was either full or close to full as there was a lot of natural illumination for the people to see outside of the car to the surrounding fields and trees. Jane made it quite clear to me that there was no partying going on, only some bored kids looking for something to do, or, as she put it, another typical night on the res. The driver of the car was pointing the car towards the surrounding trees and brushing to see if they could spot any deer or other animals by the illumination of their eyes by the car's headlights. The driver of the car was known amongst Jane and her friends as a kidder, always joking around and having fun, whereas the other person on the passenger side was known as a more serious type of guy. After having just flashed the car's headlights into the trees and brushed at the side of the road again, all the occupants of the car smelled something very, very rank. Jane compared it to the smell of a skunk or something that had been dead a while. Everyone thought that the smell must have been of a dead deer that was hit by a car and lying just off the side of the road. After having been hit by the smell, Jane saw the driver look into the rearview mirror and observed his face take on a look of shock. Jane then saw the driver nudge the guy in the passenger side with his elbow and point with his thumb towards the back of the car. Jane said that the guy on the passenger side later told her that he thought his friend, in keeping with his reputation as a kidder, was messing around but nonetheless looked in the back of the car. Jane, in watching this guy look back, saw his face take on a look of shock to match the driver's. At this point, Jane was asking what was happening and what they had seen, to which the driver replied that no one should look back and quickly floored the accelerator. Jane quickly looked out the rear window, thinking she was going to see a bear, but at first she could not see anything of worry. After a second, she saw what she thought was a tall tree stump by the road where they had just been. Turning, she told her friends in the front seat that it was only a tree stump and then turned back to look at it again, at which point the tree stump lifted up an arm so that it was parallel to the ground and began to run after the car. At this point, the other people in the back seat saw the creature too and began screaming for the driver to hurry because whatever was behind them was chasing them. Jane related that the driver was driving as fast as possible to get back to the populated area of the reserve because he felt that they would be safe then. Jane explained to me that the roadway to get back to this populated area had a right-hand turn followed by a long stretch of road and then a left-hand turn with a long stretch of road, and that the road was surrounded by fields without many trees. As the car was approximately 100 feet from making the right-hand turn, Jane looked back and saw that the creature had cut across the field as if to cut them off after they made the right-hand turn. This freaked out Jane and she started to yell at the driver to hurry up because the creature was going to cut them off and catch them. The driver increased speed after negotiating the right-hand turn, and the creature missed them by about 15 to 20 feet. As they approached the left-hand turn, Jane looked back to see the creature cutting across the field again, as if to cut them off after they made the left-hand turn. Jane yelled to the driver to hurry up, as it was going to try to cut them off again. The creature just missed catching up to the car after it had made the left-hand turn but continued to chase after the car and its screaming occupants as they made their way towards the populated area of the reserve. Jane stated that at its closest down the straight stretch of road, the creature was approximately 30 feet away. The creature finally gave up the chase after the car went across a small bridge that led to the populated area of the reserve. By this time the people in the car were hysterical and drove to the local arena as they knew a hockey game was going on with a lot of people around. Once arriving at the arena, all the occupants of the car rushed into the arena, where they met a number of friends and family who looked at them and said that they looked like they had just seen a ghost. At this point, Jane and a couple of her friends broke down into tears and related what had just happened to them. Their friends and family then took them to see some elders to inform them of what had happened and to get some advice. Although there is more to the story, I will not go further into it. Details as to the creature. At first, Jane thought that the creature was a large tree stump in the middle of the road. It was only after the creature raised its arm parallel to the road did she then realize that it was not a tree stump. In describing the raising of the arm, Jane imitated it as a person lifting their arm straight out in front of them and off to the side a little bit. Jane said that once the creature lifted its arm, she could tell that it was immense by the size of its arm. In addition, Jane stated that when it ran, you could not only hear its foot coming down, but you could tell it was an immense creature by the way its body shook under its own weight. At some point during our discussion, Jane had made statements that led me to believe that she knew it was covered in hair, but I do not recall the exact details. Also, I do not recall Jane mentioning anything regarding eyes, shining or otherwise, or other facial features of the creature. All of these details will have to be discerned from future discussions with Jane at a later date. One thing that Jane stated was that due to the size of the creature, its speed, and its apparent intelligence as demonstrated by attempting to cut them off, if it wanted to have caught them, it could have easily done so but for some reason chose not to. Jane hypothesized that it had young around and was simply trying to chase off a perceived danger to such youth. Needless to say, it did a fine job in that regard. Conclusions. I believe that Jane and her 4 friends saw a Sasquatch that night over 20 years ago. I recognize that my report is not complete and that there are many details missing, but I hope to remedy this in future conversations with Jane and a visit to the encounter site. I find this encounter one of the most frightening and intriguing. Frightening because a huge freakin' Sasquatch chased a carload of people for over 5 minutes, that really does not need an explanation. Intriguing because of the perceived intelligence of the creature, as demonstrated by its attempt to cut off the car by crossing the fields. To my mind, this type of behavior speaks of a higher intelligence that is not generally found in animals. In any event, this encounter bears a more detailed investigation to catalog the events more clearly, even though they occurred over 20 years ago. Experience hunting a cryptid. I got bored one day and just decided to watch some videos. Well, that was the day I discovered a cryptid, which also discovered that like all creatures, they can indeed die, so naturally I got a sudden idea of hunting a few. Of course, I've seen a few posts on this here and most said never do it alone, so then I gathered 4 different people, all 3 were military. Which is good because they were good with hand-to-hand combat. No doubt I felt confident, but since we still needed a plan of finding one because everyone had their doubts, they existed besides one guy, which was just someone who wanted to tag along, and we agreed, but he said he actually saw one as a kid, but one of the military people, his name was John, said that as a kid you could see things since your brain was still developing, but I'm going to do a thing to show what they said. John, well, you know you can easily see SH as a kid since your brain was still growing. The random person, well yeah, but I was 15 years old, which kind of stops doing that. John, yeah, I don't know, but can we get a move on? I'm supposed to go somewhere later. After that, one of us gave out the smart idea of going to a wooden area filled with trees where you could not even see the sky, which made a weird setting. It almost felt like it wasn't real, and another guy, Kane, pointed out we let a random guy we had never seen before tag along and we were going to ask, but when we turned to him, he was gone. Now that seems unlikely, right? Well, we saw footsteps, we thought he bailed, it didn't seem like a struggle, but John knew something was off, and we followed the footsteps, and we followed for an hour, but Kane, as always, quickly pointed out that the steps were getting farther apart. He was running fast, but there were no other tracks, so clearly he was just lost. We just called the cops and explained he seemed to have gotten lost. Cop, why didn't he just follow his tracks to get back to you guys? Everyone went silent and just looked at each other, and the cops shook their heads and walked over to the footprints and asked us what kind of shoes the guy was wearing. We didn't know, and though the cop could tell by the footprints alone. John, I don't think this is something people often pay attention to, okay? Cop, I mean, these are not shoes, these are bare footprints, almost animal. For some reason it was only one cop, and we thought nothing of it, and I forget everything kind of happened, but he did leave, and we didn't really go back, we continued actually. Our only items were a flashlight, bottles of water, and military food supplies, which John had almost all the time. We set a camp in a clearing. John, we should just set a lamp down and keep it there. After all, a cryptid could see the smoke and come after us. Kane, I think they would avoid light. John, you know if these things exist, that means there are multiple types, like that weird goat creature that just attacks. Kane, nerd. John didn't get mad but gave up on the lamp idea, and we set a fire and went to sleep. Of course that was the weird part because, in the middle of the night, the loudest scream you could have ever heard, which I think I could never forget. Also, the third guy, Charlie, was just silent if you're wondering why he has no input in the sentence because he was mute. Looking back on it now, that was kind of a bad move to have a mute guy on the team, but he was pretty strong. I was the only one that jumped up, seemingly Charlie was never asleep in the first place and was sitting on a log, assumingly keeping the fire alive. He was looking around, trying to see what the sound could have been, and that moment is the first time I've ever seen him in fear. He grabbed a gun from Charles' truck and pointed it at what seemed like thin air. Of course, since I said it seemed like thin air, it actually was nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it at where he was aiming and saw it. It was pale and had long red claws that did not look human, but it was looking at us, and Charlie turned the pistol off safety and fired. It screeched but did not run, and clearly since the gun was so loud, Kane and John got up, deeply confused, grabbed their flashlight, and pointed it around. It was bleeding everywhere, but it didn't move. John pulled a bigger gun from the floorboard of his truck and also fired, which didn't move but started inching closer. And closer, and at that point John and Charlie were firing round after round after round into the creature. We had stopped Kane from just jumping at it because he was pissed. He woke up to this thing, but he calmed down, and rat blood was almost all over the camp. He did not react to anything at all. We left immediately and gave up the idea of hunting these things. You'll call this entire story fake and bull, but being in this moment only then will you realize that maybe you're not as strong as you honestly think if a barrage of bullets couldn't stop such a thing. Kane, John, Charlie, and I got in the truck and rushed out of their camp altogether because we did not want to run into this thing, but I can only imagine how badly it would have been if I went alone and not with a team, so for God's sakes, make sure you have a strong set of people before you do this. Also, if you think you know what type of creature this could have been, please just say so. I have never seen such a thing. The stranger is unrelated, we really just think he went missing, and we're being questioned about his disappearance till this day. My Skinwalker experience. This happened about 6 years ago. At the age of 16, I was offered a job working at a scout camp. Not having any real plans for the summer and needing some source of income, though it didn't pay a lot, I decided to go. This was the first time I had really been away from parents, so the first few days were rough. Stress and homesickness were prominent. But as the days went on, friendships formed with scouts and other camp counselors. One of these counselors was named Michael. Michael was a counselor on the aquatics crew, whereas I was with the nature program. But we got along quite well. We ended up being assigned to the same tent about halfway through the summer, and it was nice. Things were going well. A nice tent mate and plenty of outdoor air. I felt great. Until, of course, this one night. I finished up my kitchen duties and headed for the tent. Michael wasn't there yet, so I decided to get my scripture study done. Yes, I am religious. I kept the tent flap open as I read. Our tent was on a hill, and the sunsets at camp were legendarily beautiful. So I got my studies done by the last sunlight of the day. A great way to end the day, if you ask me. The sun set about half an hour later, and darkness enveloped the camp. I closed the tent and laid down. I fell asleep pretty quickly for a few hours but was awakened when Michael entered the tent. "Hey man," I said. "How was the fire?" The aquatics crew had a fire once or twice a week. They typically continued well into the night. "Fine," he said. Immediately I could tell that something was wrong. He got in bed. But kept sitting up. Looking like he had heard something. For an hour he did this. Not even coming close to sleep. Eyes wide. Hands shaking. Something had happened. I figured the aquatics crew had been telling ghost stories and Michael had gotten scared. It wouldn't be the first time. I decided to let him go through it and try to get some sleep. We both had a staff meeting early the next morning, and I needed to be alert. Again, I fell asleep. "Ivan," Michael whispered loudly, "wake up, dude." I woke up and immediately heard it. Yipping and yapping. Coyotes were common in the area, so it didn't really scare me all that much. "What's up?" I asked. "They're getting closer." Michael replied. I assumed he meant the coyotes, so to satisfy him, I listened for a moment. He was right. They were getting closer. If I had to guess, I would say that when I first heard them, they were maybe a mile or so away. A distant sound that wasn't of concern. But as I listened, the yipping and yapping got louder as they got closer and closer. This was odd. Normally they stay a comfortable distance away. I still wasn't too worried. Coyotes were normally very timid. Pesting but timid, I waited some more. Listening. And the sound just kept getting louder. After a few minutes, I could hear their footsteps as their claws scratched the dirt and their heaving and labored breaths. They were surrounding the tent. They started scratching the tent. Scraping against the fabric. My heart was racing as fear settled in. This was crazy. The noise was constant. Almost like a white noise that continued for a few minutes. The walls of the tent moved with it as they scraped the tent with paws and snouts. We kicked the tent walls and made noises as loud as we could in an attempt to scare them off, but to no avail. They continued. Until about 15 minutes after the scraping started, everything went quiet. A chilling silence that lasted only a few seconds but felt like an hour, when the screaming started. "Ivan, please help me. Please, it hurts. It hurts so much, please." The voice was that of my mother. Screaming in pain. So loud I could hear it echoing throughout the camp. It sounded so real. I was halfway to the door flap when common sense kicked in. My mother lived about 2 hours away, and it was midnight at a scout camp. Why on earth would she be here? I was getting a really bad feeling. I looked at Michael, who jumped up and went for the zipper of the tent flap door. I grabbed him and told him that it wasn't real. "There is no way my mom's here, dude. It can't be her." "That's my sister," he said, "she needs me. She needs help." I couldn't believe it for a second. That was most definitely my mom's voice screaming outside the tent. This had to be a trick. I decided to try and break it down logically with him. "Michael, why would she be at camp at midnight?" I said, "This can't be real." Michael stopped, sensed the oddity of the situation, and thought about it for a minute. "Yeah. You're right." He sat back down on the floor. We listened to our close relatives scream in pain and agony for the next hour or so. My dad, my sister, and my little brother. Even a close cousin at one point. All of them. Screaming in pure terror and begging for my help. It was the hardest thing I had ever gone through not to open that tent and help them. Then they just stopped. Again, silence came to our ears. And then footsteps. But this time they weren't coyotes. These ones sounded human. Multiple people are walking around our tent in circles. Step after step. And then a voice said something I would never forget. It was a low and dark voice. Coming from all directions. Never come back, it said. Almost too quiet to hear. I looked at Michael. He was petrified. His skin was white. And tears slowly dripped down his face. Never come back or you'll pay the price. The voice said again, much louder this time. And with a force that threw us back into our pillows. Whether it was a jump back in fear reaction or the voice actually threw us, I couldn't tell you. To me, it felt like the latter. We heard the coyotes again, right next to the tent, start to run away from us. Their yipping and yapping began to fade into the night. We sat in silence until the alarm on my watch went off. 5:30 a.m. This had gone on all night. Thinking about what the voice had said, I asked, Michael? Where did the aquatics team go last night, and what did they do? He ignored me for a minute. Still shaking from what we had just gone through. And then he looked at me and told me what had happened the night before. The aquatics crew went on a night hike, he said. We had hiked a couple miles when we stumbled on some old grave markers. They looked super old, and they had language scratched on them that none of us could read. They looked almost Native American. His head drooped as what appeared to be guilt flooded his conscience. We dug into the dirt where the markers were. We messed with the sites. We just thought it would be cool if we found something. They hadn't. But then we heard someone walking through the woods. Coming toward us. So we ran back to camp as fast as we could. I was angry they had been so stupid. As someone who believes in the paranormal and as any normal person should, I have respect for the deceased and where they lay. Though scared and exhausted as we were, we decided to get ready and head to the early morning staff meeting. As we exited the tent, I looked down at the soft ground and saw what I expected. Coyote prints. But I also saw something I didn't know how to react to. A barefoot footprint. It looked human. No shoe or socks. A foot and 5 toes. I tried to show Michael, but he said he didn't want to see it. We arrived at the staff meeting, and when we sat down, I saw that the entire aquatics crew were pale and had bags under their eyes. They looked exhausted. We were then made aware that we would be evacuating camp due to a nearby forest fire. It was quite a ways off, but it was coming this way, and we wanted to be safe. So after evacuating the camp and getting all the scout troops and staff out, we headed home. When I got home, I got on my computer, still haunted by the events of the previous night, and started doing some research. I searched the area and any records of cemeteries there but came up with nothing. Then, remembering what Michael had said about the markers looking Native American, I searched Native American burial grounds in Utah, and after clicking on a few of the links, I came up with some information about supernatural findings and happenings. They were called Skinwalkers. Native American burial ground guardians who protect the sites of their ancestors. Who can shapeshift into animals and mimic loved ones. Who has been known to kill those who mess with grave sites or disrespect their tribe's tradition. When I read this, I knew what we had heard and experienced that night. What we had felt. Were Skinwalkers. To this day, I am careful with the history of the Native American people. I show as much respect as possible when even discussing their history. Believe me or don't. But every time I see anything that has to do with Native Americans, something in a museum, or maybe wall paintings, I hear the screams of my family in agony as they beg for my help. And the feeling I had being able to do nothing for them. The feeling I had as that dark and low voice said that if I messed with that stuff, I would pay the price. The unusuality of the West Siberian Bigfoot. The southwestern area of Siberia, located just north of central to eastern Kazakhstan, was known to Europe by the times of the ancient Greeks. In the lost work of Aristeas of Proconnesus, it is told the semi-historical Greek poet from Asia Minor journeyed east of the Riphean Mountains, the Urals, and found the Isidones, a Saka tribe. At the time, Iranian speakers like the Saka and Uralic speakers like the Mansi were the only inhabitants of the area, while much later migrating Turkic waves would assimilate the Iranian people and settle in the area while also intermixing with the Uralic tribes, leading to most modern pre-Russian inhabitants being Siberian Tatars, the remnants of the Golden Horde and the Khanate of Sibir, and Volga Tatars. The Isidones were believed to be at war with the Arimaspians. Due to not knowing the Saka language, Greeks assumed their name to mean one-eyed, as they thought it came from Scythian Arima one and Spau I. However, this etymology is totally inconsistent with any actual Iranian languages. This error originated from the Greek idea of Arimaspians being cyclopes. However, the Arimaspians, while not cyclopes, were not regular men either. Quoted from an article from Folklore, Volume 104, all the sources are presumed to derive ultimately from Aristeas. Aeschylus, Prometheus bound, 803 ff, characterizes them as one-eyed horsemen. Herodotus agrees and adds that they steal the gold and that they drove the Scythians west. The only other writer to add more information is John of Tsetzes, a late Byzantine writer who is generally acknowledged to have had access to earlier Greek sources now lost. He characterizes the Arimaspians as strong warriors, good horsemen rich in flocks of cattle and sheep and goats. They are one-eyed, shaggy with hairs, the toughest of men. The hairiness of the Arimaspians is confirmed by the unique Kellermes mirror, which appears to show two Arimaspians in the Gripomachy. In the mirror, although the Arimaspians are hirsute, they show no sign of monocularity. Removing the one-eye fallacy, it seems those people have human, Stian/Sacalite culture, but are also hairy and stronger than average. Obviously, they are far from the only hairy, bipedal creatures reported in the area. For example, in the not-so-far western Mongolia there is the Almas. However, while still being bipedal and hairy, this is a much less human-like and much more Bigfoot-like creature, which probably is not at all from the same species. Quoting the aforementioned article, reports of wild people in Central Asia may be found throughout history. A 13th-century Armenian traveler reported that the desert was inhabited by naked wild men with horsehair on their heads. The breasts of the females were extremely large and pendant. Such a short description could point to the Almas itself, known also for the extremely large, pendulous breasts of females, but since it calls them men, not half-human animals like satyrs, which is what ancient Greeks and Romans would have seen a bipedal ape as, since they did not have the concept of apes and of man being their relative, and satyrs themselves were likely based on relic bipedal primates now known in European fossil records, it may also rather point to actual humans with hirsute bodies. While the hirsute bodies were mentioned earlier, here they are even said to just have some crazy hairstyles, naked bodies, and a total lack of modern cultural elements. However, there is also the opposite possibility, quoted here from the same article. Almas are said to live in association with the wild sheep and goats, in the same region as the wild horse, Przewalski's horse, and are said to suck mare's milk. It is a short step from believing that Almases live commensally with the indigenous wildlife to believing that they, being anthropomorphic, have dominion over them. However, not only Europeans, with the Arimaspians, and Turco-Mongolic peoples, with the Almas, believed there were unknown human-like creatures in the area between southwestern Siberia, Central Asia, and western Mongolia. The aforementioned Khanty Mansi believe their area, just north of southwestern Siberia and east of the Urals, is inhabited by the Menk, a Bigfoot-like creature with unusual characteristics. The Menks are known to cryptozoologists as marked hominids. This is a fake category created after a Menk individual from a mysteriously unknown area in the Ural region called Mekhani, who had red hair over the body but also a patch of white hair or of naked depigmented skin on an arm. The patch is an individual, not a species-related trait. Here is the description of the Menk, quoted from Anomaly-N, a site about paranormal, but here most likely reporting actual data collected by Russian researchers. These omnivorous creatures are about 7 feet tall and have powerful bodies with muscular legs and shoulders. Their arms don't reach below the knees. Their heads, with large glowing eyes, rest low, so it appears as though they have no necks. The cryptids' rounded faces aren't ape-like. They are nocturnal, howl, and sometimes wear other animals' pelts. Marked hominids have been reported to approach villages of native people. Allegedly, the creatures have been known to trade with humans, communicating by hand gestures. And also, Mekhani was covered with fur, as Volodya had described, and had glowing red eyes. He was about 6.5 feet tall. Mekhani glanced at each person and made a soft sound like K. The legs were like a human's, not an ape's. There was no neck. Here we have something with no sagittal crest, shorter arms, long legs, a reportedly not ape-like face, but yet a low resting head and possibly gorilla-like shoulder morphology. However, other than that, the hairy body, the large glowing eyes, and the here not mentioned splayed feet are potentially the only real non-human trait it has, and large eyes and splayed feet were also typical of previous Homo species. Its ability to trade and make clothes, coupled with the geographic proximity and the hairiness of the body, may point to those creatures being the feralized remnants of the aforementioned Arimaspian culture known by Saka and later by Greek colonists. So what could be found in the area? Bigfoot-like creatures, known in Mongolia as Almas, wrongly believed by ancient natives to have a Scythian-like warrior culture, or wild-haired, possibly hairier than average on the bodies, naked and warlike savage humans mounted on horses, likely with archaic-ish sapiens, perhaps even Neanderthaloid face features, and whose females have large, pendulous breasts, who over time feralized into the modern cryptid known as Menk. Or possibly even both, two hominid species, one, the Almas, from the Australopithecus/Paranthropus clade, the other, the Arimaspians, From the Homo genus, likely from our species but with anomalous characteristics? Actually, there is a population of Bigfoot-like creatures, the Caucasian almasty, known to wear clothes. They do not make them, but rather steal them from humans. It is not even such a remarkable feat, since rarely even orangutans are known to steal clothes and to try to wear them. My brother and I had just smoked a bowl in the car at 2 a.m. outside his girlfriend's house at the time when this occurred before we drove away. Now, as we're driving down her street, in Houston for anyone curious, we make a left on reaching her end of the street so we could exit the neighborhood on the next right we had to take. Why is this important? It was in that exact moment where we turned left that I saw something that to this day I can picture so clearly. When we made that left, I saw a naked kid running down the street towards us with his arms flaying upwards like the way someone would put their arms up comically screaming on fire in a cartoon. Now, obviously, what I'm about to say will come off weird, but to me, if you're a normal human being and see someone naked, your first instinct is to look down there, isn't it? Well, in that moment I did that. And this kid had nothing. Where there should have been something was nothing but skin. No hairs. Nothing. I froze. All I felt were my eyes becoming as wide as possible. Now I know what you're thinking. This guy was just baked, he was just on a trip, ha ha ha. Only what happened next solidified what I had just witnessed. My brother just goes, "What the duck is that?" At the exact moment we both see this. Instant goosebumps. I'm not sure what those moments were leading up to us turning left because that turn felt long to get into. And why do I say this? It's because the second my brother said that this kid turns right towards a chain link fence and literally stretches into a ducking dog. A gray and brown dog. And it just goes through the fence and disappears. I instantly flip out as we exit the neighborhood. "What did you see?" I said. My brother, who didn't take this situation seriously, whatsoever nonchalantly goes, "Yeah, the naked kid running and then it became a dog." How? That couldn't have been a dog? And he just started laughing. And to this ducking day he laughs when I bring it up. I would have been too. If I didn't feel so off in how family this kid looked. Like I had seen that exact thing somewhere. And I couldn't figure it out. Until I randomly picked up Diablo 3 months later. There are these creatures in the game, to those who aren't familiar, called imps, that are quite literally small devil children running around with their arms up, doing the exact motions and movements I saw that night in the street. When I looked up imps in folklore, they're described as fairies who guide people who are lost to their deaths. My mom passes away the coming year. And my brother and I went our separate ways since. Left on bitter terms. Somehow I can't forget this night, though. And ever since deep in my soul, I felt like that was. I'm not sure what it was, but it held a spiritual significance that I could not ignore. Every chance I get to tell this story, I mostly do it to see who the person I'm talking to thinks about the paranormal and spiritual. And when I get laughed at, I don't know why the thought they're corrupt comes to mind. And it comes from this experience for some reason, like it did something to me. So has anyone else out there witnessed anything similar? The Black Wolf. Things in this world aren't always as they seem, and there appears to be much beyond our comprehension and what we are often taught growing up. This all started in the spring of 2018, when my fiancée and I decided to move back to her family's farm. Our first house was small, but the price was right, and it had what we needed with 5 acres and a barn. But after 5 years the plumbing was having issues, and we found severe termite damage that was going to be more trouble than it was worth. Financially, we couldn't afford to build what we wanted yet, and even though we both swore we would never live in a double wide, that's what we decided was the best plan of action given the circumstances until we can build our dream barn dominium on the farm. So our house is delivered and set up in March. We have 50 acres that are bordered by the Ouachita National Forest. To an outsider, these mountains may not seem like much, but it's one of the oldest mountain ranges in North America, and erosion beyond our comprehension dwindled what easily rivaled the Rockies into what you see today. This was a dream for an outdoorsman like myself. Not only did we have our own 50 acres to hunt on but thousands upon thousands of acres of deciduous mountains to roam freely. But the farm did have its oddities, and weird things sometimes happened. The first year we dated, we hunted a couple times there, and I discovered very quickly that the land behind the barn was uncomfortable. It just gives you the will and feeling of being watched. This area has a rich history of a Maine wagon trail and an Indian trail very close by. Then there's the history of the haunted inn that is on the property adjoining ours, with the inn having burned down years ago. There were many shootings over poker games and stagecoach robberies, some even reported to have been by the James Gang, and the possibility of gold buried nearby from them or the Knights of the Golden Circle. Maybe that history contributes to those feelings somehow. The property is basically laid out like a rectangle with two large barns on the east side where the driveway comes up from south to north and runs back west like a large L. First was our house, the next house was my fiancée grandma's, and at the end was my soon-to-be in-laws. I walked over to my in-laws to get some screws working on the porch, and that's where it all started, even though I was unaware until the next day, but more on that later. It was dark out when we decided to go feed our goats that were over at the barn. As we walked out, my fiancé said something big and black ran through the yard. I was like, well, how big? Our door is a mere 30 yards from the tree line that goes straight up the mountain, and we have bears from time to time, but she said more like a large dog. We got in the Jeep, and instead of heading to the barn, I turned west towards the in-laws to use the headlights, and sure enough, there was yellow eye shine in the outline of a large black dog that was maybe 60 yards from me. I get out with a cheap flashlight and call to the dog, but I get a bad reaction. Just two large yellow eyes staring back perfectly still. So I approached it slowly talking to it, trying to call it over to me, and it just trots back toward my yard. So I walk down the driveway back into the yard and try to approach it again, and I get about 25 yards from it this time, but something wasn't right about it. It all felt off. I wasn't scared or feel threatened really, but it didn't feel right. Then it hits me. Like a ton of bricks, it was as if this thing absorbed light like some dark void from another realm. No matter how hard I tried to focus my eyes or adjust the light, I couldn't make out anything with this thing before me other than that it appeared to be a dog that absorbed light. Cool. That's believable. It eventually grew tired of me wandering off across our field to the road, and I wrote it off as a neighbor's dog and moved on with my night. The next day, my fiancé's grandma asked me about our big black dog. I replied with a puzzled look, and we don't have a black dog. She told me when I walked back over from getting the screws the previous day that it came down out of the woods and had followed me back towards our house. I told her that must be the dog we saw last night. I had told my fiancé about how it seemed to absorb light, and something just didn't seem quite right with it all. And it was also massive. My shepherd is 70 pounds, and our Pyrenees Anatolian mix was 85 pounds, and it dwarfed either of them. 2 days passed without seeing the dog, and it was out of mind and rode off as a neighbor's dog from down the road or one that was dumped. 2 a.m., I'm awakened by my shepherd and Pyrenees in the house going ballistic, barking, and growling, trying to get out of their kennels. I get up and walk to the outside door as quiet as I can while the digs go ballistic and flip on the light, and the beast was on my steps and appeared to have been sniffing around the door. Soon as I turned the lights on in one fast motion, this thing did a 180 leap off the steps and was gone into the darkness again. But this time I saw its tail, a long bushy tail like my shepherd's but bigger and pointed ears. The black wolf. I know what you are thinking, it isn't scary, but to see it. The way it seemed to absorb light. It felt like pure evil. Pure hatred. Something was very unnatural about it. My brother-in-law calls me a few days later and asks me if I've seen a huge black dog or had any issues. He lives down the road and just through the woods from us, so I told him about following me and the encounters. He tells me that his pit bull he keeps out back was going wild the night before, and he went back there with a good bright light, and 30 yards away in the woodbine was a set of yellow eyes staring back. It would close its eyes, and he said you couldn't see anything like it was trying to hide. This went on a few times before he finally saw it and described it the same way I did. Yellow eyes shaped like a large wolf, but its body. That endless black pit. Somehow it absorbed all light, and you couldn't make out any details other than yellow eyes and the outline. The day after our wedding in early May, my brother-in-law calls me to tell me it came back the night of our wedding. They got home after dark. He was just sitting on the porch when he heard bawling and screaming from the woods. He grabs a 12-gram pump and his light bears feet to investigate. And there's the black wolf again on the edge of the thicket. Just the yellow eyes piercing back at him. Deciding he'd had enough, he took aim and fired. But he didn't expect what happened. A set of blue eyes suddenly appeared and dropped to the ground, and the yellow eyes vanished seemingly. He cautiously approached to see a small fawn with spots laying there where the wolf had stood, slobbering all over its back and looking dazed. He went to pet it, but it stands up, runs off right into a tree, falls over, gets back up, and bounds off deeper in the woods. He looked for the wolf but didn't see anything else, and there was no blood. He chalked it up to it having caught the fawn, and he interrupted dinner and apparently missed. We spent all our money to move, putting in septic dirt work, etc., so our honeymoon was a weekend at home before it was back to work. I told my wife I wanted to go investigate his claim. We get to his house, and he recounts his story as we make our way to the location. I look for blood, anything, and find nothing. So I start making circles in the woods and come across a big doe that was undoubtedly the little fawn's mother. I find no signs of injury on her and can only assume she was hit by a car, and that's just where she made it to. Saddened for the poor fawn knowing it won't survive and likely ended up being dinner for the wolf or coyotes. Days passed without the wolf coming back, turned to weeks, turned to months, then the dream happened. We were at a horse show, and my mother-in-law was trying to get my wife to get this horse. I told her absolutely not, we are not getting another horse, no way. It was a solid black gelding with a white blaze on its face. Next thing I know, I'm in my kitchen looking out the window into the round pen, and that horse is standing there staring at me. My in-laws had gotten it anyway. I went to ask my wife about it but couldn't find her, and when I looked back, it changed to a very dark, very weathered, haggard Indian-looking lady with long matted black hair and dreads and long yellow fingernails and wearing a very tattered, dirty long black dress with it over her head. The material almost looked like weathered burlap or fringe, and when she saw me looking at her, she smiled. Even though it was a dream, I can still remember the smile. The nastiest yellow teeth ever. I spent the rest of my dream asking people about the witch that lives in the woods by the barn. Things pretty much calmed down after that for a while. Every now and then I'd see a tree with claw marks about 6 feet high that I figured was a bear. One night while skinning a big 10 pints buck, something between us at the barn and our house lets out a huge roar/growl. Anytime you skin deer at the barn at night, something paces just inside the thicket. Sometimes it will come right for you, but shine the light, and there's nothing to see, and it stops moving. Soon as you ignore it, it will start to move again. I always leave the carcass, and the next day they are gone. My wife was alone in the barn taking care of a goat that just had babies and getting them situated while I got something she needed from home. These were originally hay barns, so the upper half on each end is open so you can hear outside pretty well when something growls at her from right outside the barn, and she tells me to hurry up and bring a rifle. But besides that, everything was pretty calm. Until it wasn't. I'm not sure what changed. It's been a few years since the wolf was around. But I couldn't shake the feeling it was back. I had off-the-wall nightmares, waking up in a state of fright at random. My shepherd would wake us up at 2 a.m. sometimes nights in a row, barking, growling, and wanting out. I let her out the first time, and she bolted straight up the mountain. I grabbed a shotgun that stayed by the door with no light and took off after her. I finally got her to call back to me but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I felt like it was trying to lure her up the mountain. Maybe because it knew I would follow? Sometimes we would wake up because it sounded like something slapped the house, but we never could find anything. It happened again. My shepherd losing her marbles at 2 a.m. wakes me up, but this time there's terrible screams coming from the goat's pen. I rush out, but it's too late. Whatever it was is gone, and so is one of the goats. The rest huddled into a corner of the shelter, trembling. I could hear the goat's cries as it was carried up and over the mountain at incredible speed. I felt so defeated. This was war. It has to stop. This land is ancient, but now it's our land. It's our home. We will not be ran off. I searched online and found no help, just a lot of people that fake scary things for social media attention. No real info. So I went to folklore. I cast some 405 grains bullets with silver mixed into the lead and loaded them in starline brass. I was going to put that new 4570 with the tritium front night sight to good use. It was cool out that evening. I had my favorite meal in case it was my last. I had no idea what I was up against or if this would work. Would it even show up again? I climbed up on my roof and settled in. The moon was about 3/4 full, so plenty of light to see from my elevated position. I started to doze off. I couldn't keep myself awake. It seemed. I awoke with a start. No idea how long I had been out, but it was silent. Uncomfortably silent. I caught movement by the drive as a large, low black shadow crept in towards the goats. I steadied that green glowing front sight on whatever my adversary actually was and squeezed the trigger. Click. Oh no. In my sleepy state, I forgot the stupid crossbolt safety that won't let the hammer fall all the way. The black wolf stands up on its hind legs. Lets out that awful roar/growl that we have heard before, the most primal sound you have ever heard. It reverberates in your chest, it's so loud, but I could barely hear it over the adrenaline dump and racing heartbeat in my ears. I cocked the hammer again, took the safety off as it dropped back to all fours, and squeezed the trigger. The heartbeat in my ears was replaced by tinnitus from the roar of the rifle, and I lost some of my night vision from the muzzle flash. The beast had fallen to the ground, thrashed about, then bolted back into the woods. I stayed up there till daylight watching. After the sun came up and it was plenty bright enough to see, I walked to where the best stood, and there was a nasty looking hunk of gray meat that smelled awful. It was the most rotten putrid smell you could imagine. I knew it had to be there. That was a 405 grain slug that can easily stop a grizzly mid-charge. As I made it to the woods, I could see small spots of dried blood, but not much and not a creature. I followed the trail where I could see overturned leaves, a broken twig, or a ground disturbance. After I made it to the top, I was really hoping I had recruited some help. I pushed on, being cautious and watching, trying not to be led into a trap of its own. I followed the trail over to the property line of the haunted inn. The land was up for sale. It never had anyone own it for long, it seemed, and I had a job to see through, so I pushed on. It led me down the mountain to where the inn used to be. Before I reached the site of the inn, the trail led me by what appeared to be an old, unmarked grave and back up the ridge and up a steep, narrow ravine with large chunks of rock and boulders. At the very top was a small opening to a cave or abandoned silver mine, possibly. The area stinks so much I could hardly keep from throwing up. The large rock overhang had some kind of old symbol carved into it, but no time to be distracted. I looked into the hole as far as I could see, and I swear there was an old spear in there like what the conquistadors carried. There was no way I was fixing to go in and find out, though. Between the smell and the horror of what I had seen and how it made it all the way back here, I was done. I wanted to go home. So I did. It's been 3 years now with no sightings or strangeness. I just make sure and leave a deer at that corner of the property every year. It's never there when I come back. I guess we have some understanding. How it all ties together is anyone's guess. A few of my Bigfoot sightings. The first one took place around the Springfield, Oregon area. This is one that was only a half-mile outside Springfield, heading east towards Marcola. As I looked on maps, it was at Marcola Road, Springfield. The barbed wire fence is gone, and it was just standing by the telephone pole, waiting for me to pass in my van. After it passed behind my van, I slowed down and looked to my left and saw this massive Sasquatch, easily 12 tall. It walked across the road in 2 strides and stepped over a barbed wire fence, and it was just at its knee height, but waist high to me, and I'm 6 feet 1 inch. One of the best ones was a mile south off the North Umpqua Highway on NF 350 between Trap Creek and Bear Creek. I was teaching some teens about tracking, the difference between tree breakage between weather and Sasquatch, and what a termite-ridden log looks like when a bear goes at it compared to a primate. I showed them natural tree falls that people call Bigfoot homes. As I was talking about the log, we heard a sound behind us. Like something was looking at us and questioned itself. We all turned to see a 3-foot-tall adolescent Sasquatch standing in some manzanita bushes. As soon as we turned, it realized we could see it, and it ducked down just to where it was looking over some leaves. One of the guys, Trevor, yelled, "Get it!" It dropped even lower and started whooping really loud. All of a sudden we heard some footsteps running towards us from the other side of the hill. It sounded like the T-Rex of JP. I forced the group to run for my Bronco because I didn't want to have to explain to the police that an idiot got mashed from a Bigfoot. I have had more, but my time is short. My last one for the day. It was weird, but completely true. I was on my way down Blue School Mount, and I think this is where it was. It's been 21 years. Anyways, I was heading down the road and stopped at an opening in the trees and had to take a leak. I stood on a small cliff, 15 high, overlooking a clearing about a square mile. Well, I started, and I heard this weird sound beneath me. Uru. I looked down, and only 8 feet below me is a Sasquatch with an annoyed, "You just peed on me" look on his face. Then, we both realized at the same time what we were looking at. It pressed up against the cliff, trying to hide. I moved to the side to get a better look, and it shifted to the other side. It wasn't that old of a Sasquatch, probably a teenager. It was definitely scared of me. I had to get some film of it and started for my Bronco, and I think there were 2 of them, because as I went to the Bronco, I saw one slimmer run towards the slope away from clearing, and it was to my left, but I heard a loud whooping where the other one was. That is where I was shaken to my core. Just after the whopping started, there was something coming down the mountainside right towards me, and it sounded like King Kong crashing through the trees. I got out of there, and I couldn't sleep for days. Thank you for letting me share. Be safe. Remember some of my advice: do not scream and point. Do not try to feed it directly or hug it. Do not throw rocks at it. Do not yell at it. And most of all, don't pee on it. My full Dogman encounter. This experience took place when I was 10 years old. At the time, I only had my mother taking care of me, no father around. We lived in PA with my great-grandmother for the majority of my childhood. My mom had made friends with a woman who owned a large lakefront property near Lake Michigan in Wisconsin. She offered to let us live in a small cabin on the property she owned in exchange for work at her art shop. So, we ended up flying up in approximately 2007. One thing that helps me remember the year is that the next year after we came back, Obama was elected president. Now, this property was located in a relatively isolated area. There were other inhabitants in the general area, but from the main road you would have to turn onto this gravel road that led into this heavily wooded area, drive for a minute or two, and then you would be on the property. On this property was a small, deep pond, a shed, the woman's house, which was decent, not too upscale but better than our cabin, and behind the house was a cliff that overlooked a shoreline of Lake Michigan. Once you get into the property, you are surrounded by woods. In hindsight, it sounds like I'm describing a horror movie setting. So when we first arrived there, I believe it was mid or late summer, possibly early fall. One weird detail was the presence of this large, red, dead fish that was just laying on the ground. I found it in between the small, deep pond and the shed. It was so out of place. It was a big fish and couldn't have come from that little pond. I have tried to Google what types of large, red fish live in Lake Michigan, but nothing I found looks like the fish I saw. The closest thing I could compare it to was a red snapper. Now that I look it up, it looks a lot like that. Part of my mind is trying to rationalize this as, maybe someone from the woman's household bought it, didn't like it, and threw it out. But why? Anyway, that was just the first of many odd things that occurred. I honestly can't remember too many other, normal life details of my time spent in Wisconsin since we were barely there a year. But when winter came, that's when I remember things starting to get a little strange. In the snow around the shed, there were these odd, huge footprints. The thing is, I remember them being round and sort of comparing their roundness to an elephant's foot, but I don't think they were that rounded. Just rounder than any normal snowflake I've seen. My mother chalked them up to bear footprints, since that was the only rational explanation we could come up with. But I don't remember them being shaped like bears. There were also some other strange snowprints. One of them looked like someone put on a pair of snow skis and walked through the snow a little. Strange thing about them is, after a while, they just stopped. My mother was weirded out about these ones. It was like whatever was walking there flew away or disappeared or something. I've considered that someone around there may have been walking in snow, but this was a fairly level, dense forest. My mom said she heard something on the radio about a wallaby escaping from captivity or something, so we just kind of sort of assumed it may have been that. We made a cute little song about bears and wallabies playing on the range or something. Now for the shitty part. Fast forward a couple months. It was in the middle of winter, and it was absolutely freezing cold outside. We're talking sub-zero temperatures. I think because we were so close to the lake, it was worse. This encounter happened late at night. Our cottage had one floor and a loft where I slept. I can't remember every detail of what exactly happened, but everything seemed normal until I was woken up by my mother panicking in the middle of the night. She ordered me to stay up in the loft and not come down. I was so confused and scared because I had never seen her act like this, and she wouldn't tell me what was going on. She had me bring up the ladder so in case something got in, it would have a harder time reaching me. So for about what felt like an hour I stayed in the loft, watching my mom as she was looking at the window with a knife in one hand and a phone on the other, scared shitless until the police arrived. When they got there, she told them she heard banging on the side of our cottage, which didn't make sense to me at the time because I didn't hear anything like that. We left the place that night and found a motel, which was just about to close until we came. I remember what that room looked like. That was without a doubt the most traumatic night in my life. I thought we were going to die because something was after us, and I'm pretty sure my mom did too. We had just moved to this cottage in Wisconsin, and we weren't even there for a full year. The incident was so terrifying that my mom immediately booked a flight back to PA, where we originally lived, but our flight was delayed. I remember doing what kids do, be impatient and move around a lot in the airport. I had stepped on a metal part of this flat escalator, which left dirt marks. This janitor guy got mad at me, and so did my mother, and I went back to feeling like shit. While we were sitting in the waiting area, there was this rude family with a girl who was making fun of me for some reason, pointing and laughing at me a little bit. We were unfortunately seated next to each other on the flight, and for some reason she started picking off her hair and placing it on my mom. It was an awkward flight with a lot of tension, which made it even worse. I also remember cussing at them on the way out of the airport. It was out of character for me to do, but goddamn, was I out of it. Since we were, and still are, very poor, we have lived with my great-grandmother for most of my childhood, never truly owning a home or property. So when we left Wisconsin, we had to come back. Things seemed to be normal for a while, and it had been a couple months after this incident. Then, for some unknown reason, my mother began behaving extremely neurotic, which I had no clue why. It really freaking stressed me out when she would do this. I can't exactly remember what she was doing, but it was enough to stress a young child out. One day she slept for longer than usual, and when she woke up, she thought she had urinated blood as her urine was a darkish color. She kept saying that she had missed time, like she had experienced an unusual amount of missing time or something. This insanity went on for about a week or so. Now, for my encounter. So on one of those nights, we were in the kitchen, my mom was making something to eat, and I was sitting in the dinner table staring outside the kitchen window. The house we lived in sat on a large incline that overlooked the town area, and I was looking at the lights from the city. Right outside of the house near this window was a large oak tree that was close to our house, with its branches being above the window about 10 to 30 feet away. It was dark, so you couldn't see anything else but the distant lights. So as I was sitting there, staring at the town lights, something red appeared in the peripheral corner of my eye. I had thought it was another city light, so my vision slowly wandered over until I was looking directly at it. One singular, glowing eye. Sort of reptilian in shape, from my memory, it's not exactly like how Mothman is usually described. I sort of remember a slit pupil like a lizard. I don't remember seeing another red eye, but it may have been obstructed by leaves or branches. I sat there kind of daydreaming a bit, not totally comprehending what I was seeing. Then it blinked, it ducking blinked. I remember backing away from the table, saying oh no, please no, and telling my mom there was something outside of the window. She looked and saw it but didn't immediately panic like I did. Honestly, this night might have been worse than the first. No, actually, I think it was because I saw it. We went up into the bedroom and were just kind of sitting there, clueless on what to do. My mom resorted back to her manic behavior and basically stayed praying over me until I fell asleep. She was still doing it when I woke up. Then we got into my mom's van and left. What happened next was super ducking stressful, to the point where I just wanted to die. For the next day or two, my mother would drive us around aimlessly in her van. She didn't have any direction or destination, she just drove crazed out of her mind. We would occasionally stop back at our grandmother's house in the daytime, but we wouldn't stay there at night. At some point, a mattress was brought into the back of her van for me to sleep on. I think we stayed in a lighted parking lot the night when I fell asleep. When I woke up, she was still driving around. I ducking hated and pleaded and begged for her to let us just go back home, even though I was also scared about returning. After much coercion and persuasion, I eventually talked her into going back to our grandmother's house so I could sleep in a comfortable bed. I was still just a kid and was really ducking tired of this bullshit. He was so paranoid and panicked that when we came back, she didn't let me eat the food she had previously made, even though it was perfectly fine. I was hungry, and to this day I hate letting any food go to waste. I enjoyed collecting stuffed animals that meant a lot to me. As memorabilia. She put them all in a black trash bag. I found them, but she still wouldn't let me have them. I think she burned them because she was burning a bunch of other stuff because of her out-of-control manic mental state. God, I ducking hated that she did that. This hurt me a lot. I loved those things. She ended up putting multiple cross statues and Jesus pictures across the house as well as outside, on the porch, on the oak tree. Even put some cross symbols on doors around the house. You know, this is actually kind of painful to remember now, even though it's so far back and removed. Like, mentally painful. One other odd thing that happened though was that while she was burning things, my grandmother gave my mom this old Bible-looking book for some reason. This just wasn't any old Bible either, it had a hard leather covering with some sort of carving on the cover. This Bible was in a language I did not know but used the English alphabet characters. It had old-looking black and white images that looked medieval in style, though I can't remember what they depicted. Probably some disturbing medieval art. My mom burned it. For the longest time, I was perplexed about what this book was and what it meant to my grandma. Was it truly a cursed and evil item that needed to be destroyed? I spent some time searching for clues and found what looks almost exactly like the Bible my mom burned. Eventually we found a place to stay with one of my mom's friends in her basement, stayed there for a week or two, and then eventually a shelter for women. It did work out though since we received some help after that and found a place in Ohio where we could live. This incident became a thing we were able to eventually leave in the past and get over, but occasionally we do bring it up and talk about it since. At first it was hard because she would not talk about it at all, but later on we were able to discuss it, and I got her to tell me what she saw outside our cabin in Wisconsin. What she said she saw were two red lights about 50 to 100 feet away from our cottage. She showed me how it was moving, whatever it was, not erratically but keeping its distance. Behind our cottage was this heavily forested area. This thing was about 50 to 100 feet away from our cottage in this forested area. Mom physically showed how it was sort of getting closer to the cottage, though it was still a considerable distance away. The two red lights never got close, or at least close enough for her to describe any features other than those two red lights. She would not let me come down from the loft to check out why she was panicking and what was happening. She had called the police and said that she had heard banging on the side of our cottage, because she knew that was more believable than if she were to describe what she was seeing. She had a knife the whole time before the cops came. As soon as the cop car arrived, she said whatever this thing was looked over at the police lights coming through, turned around, and took off running near a dilapidated barn that was located near where this thing was, further back into the forest. I never caught a glimpse of this creature in Wisconsin. At first she chalked it up to somebody with red goggles stalking us, or maybe playing a prank. She was surprisingly skeptical about it being something like a crypto. However, this argument doesn't really hold up because during our first encounter in Wisconsin, it was late at night during winter. It was extremely cold up where we lived, and especially since we lived right next to a great lake. I don't think anybody would have been out there to play a prank like that or try and spy on us through a small window in our cottage. Now, this is where a strange little discrepancy pops up. Some time after the first encounter of this thing in Wisconsin, we again had an encounter with a red glowing eyed being right outside of our grandmother's house, where we had lived for many years secure and without paranormal incident. This to me suggests that this may have been the same entity in both encounters. So how did it travel such a distance? Why did it travel across many hundreds of miles just to harass us? It has no logic. Such a feat makes me believe that whatever we encountered was not a normal physical being, bound by laws of physicality, and traversing such distances really would not be a problem for it. There's also the subject of what this really was. For many years, the only explanation that I could come up with was that it was an actual, real demon. Since this incident, it has popped up in my mind occasionally. Sometimes I would just happen to click myself into the paranormal side of internet, where they talk about cryptids and supernatural happenings and phenomena. This piqued my curiosity, and I began doing some online research, comparing other people's encounters and descriptions of various kinds to my own. I have since read, heard, and listened to other people's encounters with beings that also have glimmering red eyes. This actually appears to be a common phenomenon that comes up in such encounters. There are a few Bigfoot sightings, and some are reported to have red eyes. Both the Mothman and the Flatwoods monster were described with red, glowing eyes. I have read of 1 or 2 alien encounters where they had red eyes. And apparently, dogmen are often reported as having glowing red eyes as well, though not all. This is definitely a supernatural phenomenon. And one that inspires fear. I would go back and forth in my mind trying to figure out which cryptid this could have been. I did not see the whole body, thank God. If I saw a ducking giant werewolf-looking thing with murder eyes in a tree outside, my soul would have jumped out of my body. I have heard many other people on the DME podcast describe them with red eyes, and there was one episode in particular that reminded me of my own encounter, only the guy could see the full body. He said it was also in a tree. Then there was the location. I think where I lived was not too far off from Bray Road, where the infamous Beast of Bray Road was reported. That one had red eyes. I honestly don't have too much else to compare, but if anything would be living out in that forest, walking around in Antarctic winds and deep snow without a problem, it would probably be one of these beasts. I originally just wanted to share my encounters with this thing that harassed us. It's just that I have never told anybody about this entire ordeal, this chapter of my life, mostly bound by paranoia coming from my mom. It almost feels kind of good to get off my chest, cathartic to type this out. To this day, that shit still sticks with me. I stayed up over an hour typing this out and haven't proofread it because I am tired and am about to go to sleep. I'm pretty nervous about how this is going to be received. I'll try and answer any questions. If I'm able to and clear up anything that I might be misunderstood. Please understand that this is my first time really putting myself out here with this information. I know my mother said for me to always keep this whole ordeal a secret, but I couldn't talk about it any longer. So, in these recent years, my research has led me down a rabbit hole into fringe topics and strange subjects regarding the paranormal and the true nature of reality. After many years of reading, watching, listening, and researching, I think I may have a theory about what dogmen actually are. But a lot of it has to do with. Not sure how I should say this, but understanding what dogmen are requires a greater understanding about the true nature of reality itself. One needs an open mind for this. I say this because initially I disregarded this whole subject area as crazy schizophrenic bullshit, ironically unaware of how my own experiences could be labeled the same, even though these were objective experiences. I admit I don't have the whole picture, far from it, but slowly I am putting the pieces together. I'm actually glad I took so long to write this, as a year or two ago I did not have the current knowledge or state of mind that I currently have. I think I might make a separate writing about my theory of what I think dogmen actually are and how they're part of a greater aspect of our reality and existence that is poorly understood. I hope one day I might be able to understand what dogmen are and also help others in doing so.